We'll call the meeting of the Minot City Council to order for today, Monday, June 17th, 2019, seeing it is 5:30. I would ask once again if you can silence or put your electronic devices onto silent or vibrate. We'll keep the distractions down to a minimum. Roll call, please.
Janser.
Here.
Olson. Here. Pittner.
Here.
Padragula.
Here.
Straight.
Here.
Wolski.
Here.
Sitma.
Here. Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Number 3 on our agenda is personal appearances. This is an opportunity for anyone in the audience to speak on an item that is or is not on our agenda. If you would just come to the podium, your name and address, and what you're here to speak about.
My name is Rick Rodman. I live at 433 21st Street Southwest, which is right on the west side of Perkins School. And I'm here to talk about our beautiful levees we have down there. And I mean that for a fact. I'm quite proud of them. My wife and myself bought our home in '73, so I've been down there a while. And I talked to Shannon Straight the other day because straight down from the street from me, there's already been individuals who have taken their motorized vehicles, I believe it was trucks, and gone up and down the side of the levee, which causes harm to it. That is why I'm here. I believe the city council should pass an ordinance with a mandatory $500 fine and the repair of any damage done to that levee by any individual who is not authorized to be on there. It's the least we can do to provide safety of that levee. Every person in this town has a vested interest in that levee, millions of dollars, and I appreciate that. But I also believe we need to have strength in taking care of that levee. And that's the only way we can do it. It needs to be signed. It needs to be stated what the mandatory fine or minimum fine should be, $500. And they repair that levee at their cost. And that's what I have to say. And I hopefully wish you do that. And I would like to thank Shannon Straight for talking to me the other day. Thank you.
Rick, I appreciate you being here and bringing this to our attention, and certainly I think we can have our city attorney take a look at what current ordinance we have on the books, as I do believe we do have some legal statutes already within our ordinances, but we'll go ahead and take a look at those because you're absolutely right, Mr. Rodman, that we are spending a significant amount of money to build these new levees and protective barriers that we certainly don't want damaged.
In fact, right down the street from me, the crews are, and I would like to mention the crews, they have been great. I walk down there every day and talk to those guys. In fact, last weekend they gave me a tour of the new pump house with the 3 giant pumps that are gonna pump the water out of the old Perkins ditch into the river. And it is amazing to see that. We call it the church because it kind of looks like a church, but it's outstanding. And those guys are outstanding, a great bunch of workers. And I'm proud to see it. Thank you.
Thank you there, Mr. Rodman. Anyone else for public appearances for this evening? Any issue that is not on our agenda? This is your opportunity to speak. Again, if you would state your name and address for the record.
I'm Kirsten Ing. I live at 800 Main Street North. And I've been talking to Shannon as well and Lisa. And I talked to Paul too once about the junkyard across the street. It's on the corner of University and North Main. And I think it needs to be cleaned up.
Alderman Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Hackett, this is your photo opportunity that I sent you earlier today. If we could just bring this up, Mr. Mayor, just for a kind of a frame of reference, that this is a point of contention that we've had with other property owners in town. If you could go back, yeah, there you go, Derek. My understanding was that it was a homestead at one time that had been torn down, that's now a vacant lot. Clearly, we're having vehicles left on it, weed issues. I believe, ma'am, you had spoken with Ms. Zietz about this possibly
Yes,
as much as
last
2
year.
years ago, or last year?
Yep, and
Okay.
nothing's been done.
Yep. So I think, Mr. Mayor, it's also just kind of pointed out that when City Manager Barry was away, Mr. Lakefield had talked about maybe a streamlined system that we could have folks like this, where we could have a speedier, expedited process for staff to be notified of what's happening, where the residents could then have some documentation trail to follow for some resolution, because I think everybody in the audience, as well as all of us up here, realize that with the tax increases last year, everybody expects better customer service, and for some of these issues to be dealt with in a more timely manner. And this is one where whatever we need to do to look into it, I think, folks want to protect their property, and I think we have to just address it the best we can.
And then the house next door to it is a vacant house, it's a rental house. I think they abandoned it because the lawn hasn't been mowed all summer, and it just looks like nobody's been living there. So that's right next to the junkyard.
Did you, by chance, Ms. Ing, have the opportunity to file that complaint for overgrown weeds or nuisance?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Just a recommendation on that, with overgrown yards that are nuisances, to file a complaint so that we do know about those, even if you filed for the junkyard, as you put it, to ensure that we have all of those listed, so we can track them as well.
Sure, okay,
But I appreciate the diligence of keeping an eye on that.
alrighty, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor,
Alderman Olson.
just a little bit of history on that. I have visited with Ms. Eng. I did contact Ms. Zietz, and she contacted the property owner, who guaranteed that those vehicles would be moved off in a matter of 3 days. That was approximately 3 or 4 weeks ago when we visited. This is the first that I've heard back on it, so we were under the assumption that the vehicles were moved, so it's good to know now that they have not been, because that property owner will need to be contacted again.
Alderman Straight.
And one more thought, just kind of piggybacking on Mr. Rodman's point, is if the council needs to adjust and kind of increase fines to improve kind of some of these procedural issues getting moved by neighbors more quickly, maybe that's something we're going to have to take a look at. Clearly, I don't want to be looking at every issue, but I think the process that Ms. Zietz must have to go to notify that property owner, there's a lag in time. Clearly, Ms. Eng's been waiting patiently and diligently for too long, and maybe we have to just kind of evaluate our own process to better respond to resident complaints.
And just for a little historical reference, as well as many of the homes following 2011 that were taken down for damaged reasons or foundation issues, whatever it was. I can think of a couple, one specifically from a former coworker of mine, that the neighbor then adopted it as the parking grounds for everything that he owned. So it certainly isn't a new problem, but it is one that certainly I think we can take a deeper dive in without expending a significant amount of staff time and other issues. But it is something that we greatly appreciate bringing to our further attention. Is there any other issue? Sorry, Alderman Pontargula.
I just wanted to add my voice to what has been said previously. With that voice, we have 4 members of the council out of 7 now who have concerns about this issue. In my own neighborhood, about a block away from my house, there's a house with all sorts of junk cars, and the other direction is another one. And I think that's something the city really, whether taxes were raised or weren't raised, really needs to look at more seriously, the issue of code enforcement. And if that means, adding staff or certainly revising procedures or making it easier for citizens to lodge complaints and get some follow-up in terms of what happened, I would strongly support that.
Final call for public appearances. All right, seeing none, we'll move to item number 4 on our agenda, the public hearing.
A public hearing to consider a request by Kevin Frederick to relocate a 40-foot by 60-foot steel building from 2005 Burdick Expressway East, Minot 58701, to 6201 24th Avenue Southeast, Minot 58701, subject to conditions.
And for anyone that follows very closely, this may look a little familiar as it was on our agenda last meeting. However, because of a small notice issue, it is before us one last time for proper noticing guidelines. So this is a public hearing, an opportunity to speak in favor or against the item that is on the agenda before us. Please come forward and your name and address for the record, please.
Owner, I didn't know if you wanted to hear from me at all, or if you needed anything from me.
If you have anything to say or if anyone has any questions, this would be the opportunity.
So I just would like to be able to use it for cold storage of vehicles and tractors. So.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Alderman Straight, perhaps.
Mr. Mayor, I would close the public hearing and approve the item.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Straight, second by Alderman Pittner. Any discussion on the motion? Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula.
Yes.
Motion is approved. Public hearing is closed and issue is passed. Number 5 is the mayoral appointments. You see that I do have a couple of them before us this evening, both for the Magic Fund. Steve Bigelow appointed to replace Pat Bachmeyer with a term expiring June 2022, and the Planning Commission Dustin Offerdahl reappointed with a term to expire on June 2024. Alderman Janser.
Mr. Mayor, I'll move your appointments.
Second.
Moved by Alderman Janser, second by Alderman Olson. Any discussion on the motion? Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula.
Yes.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes, motion is approved. Number 6 on our agenda this evening is the council legislative report. We have Mr. Shane Gettle, who is here, our legislative liaison, and helped us out significantly down at this year's legislative session, keeping us not only up to date what was going on, but helping lobbying on our efforts. Mr. Gettle, appreciate you being here this evening with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And also I want to thank each and every one of you. I think nearly every one of you came down and testified in favor or in opposition of one bill or another as we went through the legislative session. Before I begin, though, I want to say that with the biggest bill that you'll hear from tonight, the prairie dog bill, the one I think that has profound impact on the funding formula for Minot out of the oil and gas production, that work began 2 years ago. And I want to thank both mayors for their commitment to that process, because you'll see tonight that it bore fruit. I spent a lot of time on the road as well with city finance person and your city manager. Both David and Tom were instrumental in moving this along. This began with an interim process and resulted in a final bill that benefits Minot. So how do I advance the slides, Derek? Okay. Let me give a quick overview. The session wrapped up on the 76th day. This session saved 4 days. It could call itself back into session if it needed to. This is one of the first times in recent memory that they've done this. There were a total of 905 bills introduced, 520 bills passed each chamber. For Minot, I tracked about 160 bills, and I have reduced that down to about 32 bills, especially those that were testified on, and I've got a nice spreadsheet I could give any one of you upon request that gives a lot more detail than what I'm presenting here tonight in terms of what was covered for Minot. The legislature passed a $14.7 billion two-year budget. The true measure of what's being spent, though, is the general fund portion of that. That's $4.8 million. That's up 12% from the previous biennium. But just to note, it's nearly $2 billion less than the record general fund expenditure in 2013 to 2015 of $6.8 billion. And of course, there were no tax increases this session. First bill I want to touch upon is Prairie Dog Bill. That was House Bill 1066. It included changes in the funding distribution of the gross production tax that impact Minot. It also included a number of other provisions, but I want to touch upon that part of the funding formula first. This is the current distribution model that ends on June 30th, and the one that was in effect for this biennium. I've highlighted the flow that goes to Minot, and you'll see that under the gross production tax, which is a 5% tax, there's a 1/5 side of it and a 4/5 side. And Minot as a hub city was on both sides of that. That was problematic because on the 1/5 side, where a lot of legislators questioned its permanence, there was always a sunset on this funding formula. And to get rid of that sunset, we had to reposition the hub cities in this entire funding formula, to take them out as a target for sunsets in the future. The current funding formula, just real quickly, part of it then on the 1/5 side was based upon mining employment, and the other side was a pool of funds that was split 60% to Williston, 30% to Dickinson, and 10% to Minot. Okay, so that's just a framework for the old formula. Here's what the new one looks like. The hub cities are taken out of the 1/5 side of this formula altogether, and they're just on the 4/5 side. Now, how is this done? They're still in two different places. You'll see the flow. For counties that have less than $5 million total in production, they get to keep 100% of it. So it's big counties that are producing over $5 million in production that the rest of this formula flows through. The state gets 70% of that, and the counties get 30%. You'll see on the state side that there's a pool for hub cities now of $22 million per year or $44 million per biennium. That's a fixed amount in that part of the formula. And that'll get split in a way that I'll show you here in a moment. The other side of it is the same position the hub cities have been in before, a 9% pool that flows through these counties that have produced over 5 million. You'll see the buckets under there. The 9% pool is split among the hub cities, but now instead of just an arbitrary percentage, it's based on an impact score. Both of these things are based on impact scores that we worked hard on during the interim. The legislative assumptions now to arrive at what can Minot expect in terms of funding through this formula, these are the legislative assumptions you see before you. 1.4 million barrels a day at $48.50 per barrel in the first fiscal year, and in the second fiscal year, the production going up, but the price coming down. That kind of has the effect of evening this out. The impact score is based upon, in part, the amount of employment in mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction. That's a change because it was previously just tied to mining employment. And there are 6 factors now that go into the impact score. This just affects what's the percentage that Dickinson, Williston, and Minot were to get. And this can change over time now because we've agreed upon some allocation here based on these. So you'll see hub cities percent of that MQOG employment, and then an average of that type of employment relative to the other employment in all the counties in the human service regions that each hub city is located in, the percent of establishments engaged in those industries, the percent of oil production in those human service regions. So Minot's whole human service region includes, for example, Mountrail County, which is the biggest producing county in that region. And then percentage change in population over a period of 5 years, and then percentage change in population in the last 5 years in the county in which that hub city is located. So that's the impact score. So we're on the 4/5 side of the gross production tax formula, and I worked with the tax department to try to get some, in the wake of the session, to try to get some idea what Minot could expect. So let's hold to those legislative assumptions of production and price. Let's use those. And Minot's impact score is going to land between 12 and 13%, we predict right now, based on those factors. So this formula should generate $6.28 million per year in both fiscal years for the city of Minot. So that's $12.6 million for the biennium as a conservative estimate. And I say conservative because some of the legislature took a little criticism sometimes for being too conservative in its forecast. Okay. Now, you increase the price of barrel of oil by $10 and hold everything else the same. The formula would then generate about $7 million per year in each of the fiscal years for a total of $14 million for the biennium. Now let's take a look at, this is a summary then. The conservative case is $6.28 million per year, aggressive case 7. So we have a range for the biennium of 12.56 to 14 million. How does this compare to where we're at today? I've outlined the assumptions again in the impact score, and in the present biennium where we're both on the 4/5 and the 1/5 side compared to where we're at now. I'm sorry, that should be 4/5, not 1/5, up under 2019 to 2021. The amount that was received and then projected for this present biennium, and this amount would be received by August or September, because there's overlap in when it's distributed versus when it's counted, would be 8.036. And for the upcoming biennium then, 12.56 to 14 million is the projected. So you can see that the ball's been advanced by over $4 million for the biennium, at least for the city of Minot, and hopefully more if we have a more robust production and price. Both of them are biennium formulas, but the difference in the duration is the one was sunsetted, and this one doesn't have a sunset. Doesn't mean the legislature can't change it, but it's far more now permanent in law than it was before. And we have a formula that can change over time as the factors in each of the cities change over time. I think it's entirely possible as Dickinson and Williston mature that the formula is going to even out a little bit more going into the future. So again, this is a summary of where we're at in the formula now with no sunset. Any questions on that before I move on? Okay, there's other aspects of this funding formula then that I think are relevant to our discussion tonight. The state share, after you get distributions out to the counties and townships and cities, the state share goes through a series of buckets. This set of buckets is fed by both the gross production tax, which I just showed you, as well as an extraction tax, which I'll show you here in a bit. But the state share goes through these buckets. Prairie Dog bill also set up a county and township infrastructure fund. Minot does not participate in this municipal infrastructure fund, but Ward County does on the county side of it, because they are deemed for the purposes of this to be a non-oil producing county. So Ward County itself will benefit there. And then there's an airport infrastructure fund that will have up to 20 million in it, assuming everything stays according to the forecast, and this gets funded. And that's for airports all across the state to apply with the State Aeronautics Commission. And then there's the Strategic Investment Improvements Fund. That could have approaching $1 billion in it as we go into the next session of cash that the legislature would have available to spend. So keep that in mind in terms of infrastructure in the future. Okay, that's the summary of the gross production tax and what we accomplished with the Prairie Dog bill. The next bill I wanted to highlight was the Water Commission budget. This is Senate Bill 2020. This is funded through the extraction tax. So we looked at the gross production tax of 5%. There's also this extraction tax of 5%. And the water budget is funded out of the 20% Resources Trust Fund. This is the project funding for the Water Commission, and I highlighted where Minot is really located for some of your key projects. There's $128 million for water supply, and then $82.5 million is the number. We worked pretty hard on this too, for Mouse River flood control. The summary of this bill then, there's $82.5 million in funding level for this biennium, and there's legislative intent, and I want to walk through this so everybody understands it. The legislative intent that was begun 2 years ago is that the state provide $193 million in state funding for Mouse River flood control projects within the city limits. Okay, this number applies to that which is done inside the city limits of Minot. This does not take into account the funding that's needed outside the city limits. I want to be clear about that. So the $57.7 million is what was recognized for the present biennium. Subtract that off the 193. We have $82.5 million in intent for this biennium, and the remainder then would be in the 4 years that follow from 21 to 2025. So that's what's in place right now. These still need to be funded in future biennium, but that's what's in place now. Northwest Area Water Supply. That project was accounted in the water supply appropriation. The State Water Commission can also tap a $75 million line of credit at the Bank of North Dakota if it's needed for the cash flow on these things. Hopefully that's not needed, but it's there and available for this project if it is. And then another project that did get counted in the legislative intent because they utilized the state water plan, and there was plenty of funds coming into this. The state water plan was used to provide some guidance, and that included the Minot's Southwest Elevated Water Tank. The state water plan has in it 2.76 million in cost share against 1.84 million in local funding for 4.6. It's a real advantage to have this in legislative intent because you can use that in your application for the funds when you go to the State Water Commission, in addition to the fact that it's in their State Water Commission plan already. Then there was a companion bill for political subdivision finance. This was intended as a companion bill to Prairie Dog because originally drafted, Prairie Dog had this in it. We decided to take this out to make Prairie Dog a little more streamlined. This is Senate Bill 2275. Quick summary of this. This would have set up a state bond to support capitalizing revolving loan fund for political subdivisions to access that capital at 2% rates for up to 40 years. This bill was that should be 2275, was defeated. My legislators, however, did rally to support this bill's passage. I have to give a lot of credit to both the senators and the House members in this. This was then resurrected in OMB's budget bill in the Senate, but it was cut in House appropriations. And then there was one last effort. It was one of the last things that Senator Wardner tried to do, who was a real champion of this on the Senate side, tried to get this into the Joint Conference Committee in the OMB budget bill. There were 6 members, 3 from the Senate, 3 from the House. You have to have a 4-vote majority in order to get it through. It failed in that effort too. But 3 attempts to try to get this through. It was defeated largely because of concerns about the state getting in the business of bonding to capitalize this. That was the objection we couldn't get over House leadership for. We tried. Mayor Sean Sitma and city manager came down several times, including some private visits, to try to push this bill. But we just could not get that done. However, it's a big topic for the interim, and I'm going to end tonight on that when we get through the rest of this. Other top track legislation, I'm going to start with bills, a mixture of bills that passed as well as bills that failed here. So bills that passed on property tax and special assessment summary, there was some changes to homestead tax credit that passed. Local boards of equalization can now meet any time in the first 15 days of April rather than just, as I understand it, on the second Tuesday, so there's some flexibility there. Defeated bills, and these are bills that Minot representatives came down and testified against. Limitations on property tax levies without voter approval. There were several bills on property valuations, changes to the appeal process, valuation caps, appraised value as a substitute for true and full value. Those were all defeated. And then the processing of special assessment fund balances. We engaged in all of these, and these were defeated. There were some bills pertaining to zoning and special improvement districts that I've lumped together here. Past bills clarified city authority to zone territory adjacent to cities. Here's one that we did oppose, but it passed. It was a city may not impose a building permit fee in an ETZ area higher than inside the city. Now a city must have the same fee in both in-city and outside the city. Property owned by a city cannot be included when calculating majority area of property owners included in improvement district. And then there were some defeated bills that we testified against, allowing ETZ owners to vote in special election on proposed ETZ extensions. That bill failed. The handling of special assessment fund balances and requiring a special benefit to levy a special assessment. I'll just quickly go through other bills that we engaged on a little bit to some extent. Park districts can now issue general obligation bonds. There were term limits removed for concessions. We were tracking that. There were several bills regarding public bidding where the thresholds were raised or flexibility was given. A couple bills that were really important to the Minot community. Retirement taxation or retirement military benefits. These are not now included anymore in North Dakota taxable income. That's a big benefit for retirees and keeping them here in North Dakota, keeping them in this community. And occupational licensing was streamlined and made it a little easier for military spouses to obtain provisional licenses for certain occupations. You remember the white papers that we engaged on? These were 2 of the items that were on those white papers, and the Minot delegation in particular was very supportive of these. And then local recalls have more limits now than they used to. Local recalls, there can be no late recall if a special election will be held within a year of a regularly scheduled election. It's a year, that's the change. It used to be calendar, within the calendar year in which that election occurs. Now it's a full year from the time of that election, okay? Other past bills in law enforcement and fines area. Interviewing law enforcement. If you're doing due diligence and you're interviewing candidates for law enforcement positions, for candidates that are not selected, the due diligence, the references that you check are not public record. There were some changes made to civil asset forfeiture as well, kind of a big compromise bill in the end on that. Failure to stop at a stop sign, the fine was raised to $40. There's a critical infrastructure bill that includes water and sewer and other types of city-based infrastructure where the fines, as well as any groups that are organized to damage that infrastructure, can be fined and assessed, and the penalties were raised. And then city fines related to motor vehicle operation or traffic were also, there was more flexibility given there for cities to address those. There were some changes in municipal courts and judges. There's more flexibility on hearings now, including electronic hearings. So for the first time, a municipal judge can be deemed present if he's participating electronically in a hearing. Raises penalties for a violation of city ordinances in some certain specific areas, and it clarifies when term ends and the office is abolished. Some other things, legal notices now need to be published not only in the paper, but also on a newspaper's website, and if they have one, and they also have to be put out to the Newspaper Association's website. Any defects in those notices are not deemed to be a defect in noticing the meeting itself, but they have to be there. Cities now are, this is an area of local control. So you win some in local control, you lose some in local control. There's a living wage prohibition now. Cities cannot put forward a living wage that exceeds the state's minimum wage. Auxiliary containers, big topic for Minot. We had some testimony on this. This is the plastics bill. Cities cannot regulate auxiliary containers, paper bags, and other terms of plastic. For interviewing anybody for a public office, there's now a restriction on inquiry into the criminal record of that person until such time as they're selected for interview. This has to do with trying to integrate those who've had crimes in their past into our society a little more, give them a second chance. So only when they're selected for an interview now is a criminal record background check permitted. Right-of-way crossings, that was streamlined. So if you have utilities that need to cross a railroad crossing, there's a new bill now that outlines and tries to streamline and speed up that process. There's no firearm buybacks allowed by local political subdivisions. There was some changes in the way lodging taxes are administered. I don't know if that makes any difference for City of Minot, but it had to do with the local group advising the City Council on how those lodging taxes should be spent. And then there's protections for records related to disaster preparation plans and cybersecurity as well that were put into law. That not making those incidentally not open to public record under the circumstances outlined in the statutes. Defeated bills that Minot engaged on. There was one regarding party affiliation that would have authorized party identification in local elections. That was defeated. Another bill that would have required adoption of a preliminary city budget by July 10th of each year. That was defeated. Weighed in on arbitration of controversies arising out of a contract for an above-the-grade road or street improvement. Would add another layer of dispute resolution into an existing process. Required it, in fact. Prohibiting use of eminent domain without approval of a county commission. That was defeated. And then one that we did support was Senator David Hoag's amendment, constitutional amendment related to use of legacy fund principal and earnings. That just did not generate enough support to get it even past its first chamber. I want to address some interim studies that I think the City of Minot should be watching and paying some attention to. There's one on sewage treatment systems. You can see all of the different things that are to be taken up by the interim committee on sewage treatment systems there. The next bill is emergency and interoperable public safety communications. There's a study on that. Special assessment alternative. The City of Bismarck really wanted to get rid of special assessments and in its place put a utility tax or surcharge, they called it, on top of existing utility bills that are sent out. They offered it as an alternative. They had some steam on it, but then finally ran into a brick wall, couldn't get the support. It was transformed into a study, but this is one to watch. And then a final one I've chosen to highlight tonight is one on legacy fund earnings. There will be an interim study dealing with legacy fund earnings as opposed to the principal. Let's take a look at that heading for now. That's the earnings. Lots of uses, as you well know, and debate about how to spend the earnings on the legacy fund. Everything from tax relief to funding research and technological investments. And Among the topics, of course, will be infrastructure. It's the iteration of 2275. Should we use the earnings like was originally proposed to help capitalize a revolving loan fund for cities to access low-interest loans for a very long term? And I want to highlight here, the committee may consider public input and use of legacy fund earnings. This is an area we may want to consider putting in as much intense work as we did on the Prairie Dog bill going into the interim. And this and other efforts. I can tell you that I'm confident there will be groups working on, independently of this, on another effort to revive 2275 in some form or another and get the legislature in a position to fund that. Lots of options, legacy fund principal, legacy fund earnings. The cash that I talked about that fills that bottom bucket, cash going in the next session, maybe approaching $1 billion, that's a potential source to capitalize a revolving loan fund. And so all of these issues come into play. In terms of all of the bills that I've outlined here, I've got a spreadsheet that provides a whole lot more detail. I haven't given you that spreadsheet, but it is available. Tom has seen it, Derek has seen it. If you want to know who's on that spreadsheet, I also included a column that shows you exactly how each minor legislator voted on that as well. So I can make that available to you. I think I've made it available to Tom and to Derek, so you can request it from them or you can request it from me. And it's best viewed in a legal form size paper because it's rather large. But with all of that, I'd be happy to address any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gettle. Any questions for Shane? As I know, quite a few of us were very well involved with a lot of these issues throughout the session, and many more were watched carefully and relayed back to us, as not every one of us could be down there at all times. I think one of the questions that early on in discussions regarding Prairie Dog funding was the use of those funds and how they can be used within that hub city mechanism. So perhaps, Shane, if you could elaborate a little bit, restrictions and or placement within those funds.
Sure. Let me go back to this because I think this is very, very important. There are restrictions where I've circled, you see where I've circled and put Ward County, you see the municipal infrastructure fund off to the left. There are restrictions on how cities can spend those funds. This is not where mine it is. Those funds can only be spent on critical infrastructure defined in the statute. There is no such limitation for hub cities. That money comes into your budget. You are free to program that as you choose. And so we hear of restrictions in Prairie Dog bill, but that applies here, not to the hub cities.
Thank you, Shane. Any further questions for Mr. Gettle before we turn him loose? Mr. Berry, do you have?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to, in front of the community and City Council, thank Mr. Gettle for his leadership and time and attention down at the State House during this last legislative session. I know we have talked in the past about Mr. Gettle's contract and the value that it provides to the city. And I can tell you firsthand, having this be my second legislative session with the city, that Mr. Gettle is worth his weight in gold. We have made considerable strides in improving our relationship with members down at the State House and improving our position and our overall, I think, approach with the way that we deal with legislative issues that involve or concern our citizens or the operation and administration of our city. So, Mr. Gettle, I just wanted to say hats off to you. Thank you. I know that you've helped essentially all of the staff, oftentimes with research, oftentimes with legislative review and analytical work. It has been just great working with you, and I appreciate all that you've done on behalf of our city.
Thank you very much. And I will say that the change of pace was actually refreshing. There was more engagement from the entire City Council, and that was a deliberate choice on your part. And I appreciate that very much as well.
Thank you, Mr. Gettle. Alderman Straight.
Mr. Mayor, Shane, I second Mr. Berry's comments. I guess one thing that I would like to figure out for our standpoint, I think, moving forward is how we, as you can imagine, we have probably a handful of very vocal citizens. And as much as our legislators and state representatives want to hear from local elected leaders, they'd much rather hear from some other residents. And I think as we move forward, we have to figure out a way where many of us are going down there. Who's that handful of people that we could possibly pull with Shane's always been great at sharing, language, and as we've thrown back testimony back and forth, I think we have people that could jump in a vehicle and speak to some of those issues. That's just something to throw out there, Shane. I think as you move forward and working with us, how can we get some other residents to piggyback and follow down to testify, because that's more important than hearing from us. So thank you, Mr. Gettle.
Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, thanks. I wrote down almost the exact same note that Alderman Straight mentioned in terms of, in the next session, in terms of our game plan, getting more of the community engaged with this process, because I felt that same piece too in terms of just the hierarchy of who the legislators seem to really want to hear from, and we were higher or more important than others down there, but also less important than I think citizens at large. And so I think it would be just wise to recognize that. Perhaps even Mr. Barry, as a part of our council retreat, I know that there's a developing agenda there, but a bit of an after action and approaches for the next 2 years. I know you guys were working diligently on the Prairie Dog bill. We as council entered this game a little bit later, September, October of last year, but the sooner we start, the better.
Again, thank you, Mr. Gettle, on behalf of the entire city council and the city. I know personally I called you several times well past 9 o'clock for some input on things. So I appreciate you taking the phone call and providing the information that you did and the work. Thank you.
It's a pleasure working with you all. Thank you.
Thank you. That takes us on to number 7 on our agenda this evening. That is, unless I have there we go, consent items 7.1 through 7.13. Do we have any individual items that need to be pulled? Alderman Janser.
I'll move approval on the section 7 item for consent.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Janser, second by Alderman Pittner. Any items within these consent items will be passed as recommended by staff. If anyone does need an individual item pulled for discussion, please go ahead and let us know. We can pull that for individual discussion. If not, it will be passed on consent. Any discussion on the motion?
I have a brief comment. I noticed item 7.10 is the yet again another award of a grant from a private entity, and this was related to some forcible entry training equipment. As I looked over that one, the only question that arose, and I don't need a specific answer tonight because we have lots of examples of this, but I kind of wondered, how is it that we, the city, go about saying thank you for these particular grants? It's just one of those little pieces of these interactions and the opportunities that are extended to us by these organizations. And I wonder if there's a way to be very intentional and grateful for the support that we're given in these organizations, by these organizations. So I just wanted to raise that question and get it into our thinking.
Further discussion on the motion for consent on the passage of 6.1 through 6.13. Sorry, 7. Got a number disparity on our screen, so we're clear. 7.1 through 7.13. Please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padrigula,
Yes.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes, motion is approved on the passage of the consent items. That takes us to Section 8, the action items. 8.1 is the settlement agreement to acquire properties at 210 7th Street Northeast and 706 4th Avenue Northeast for flood control projects. The recommendation, City Council approve the settlement agreement of the matters entitled to Ken Simonson and Lynette Simonson and the United Community Bank of North Dakota, plaintiffs versus the City of Minot defendant, for the value that is listed on the screen, $1.75 million, and authorize the mayor to execute and all documents necessary to the settlement of the acquisitions of this property.
Move approval.
Motion by Alderman Olson to approve.
Second.
Second by Alderman Janser. Discussion on the motion. Any discussion on the motion? Please call the roll.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padrigula,
Yes.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Janser.
Yes.
Motion is approved. 8.2 is the alcoholic beverage license renewals for 2019 through 2020. Recommended that the City Council approve the alcoholic beverage licenses renewal for the period of July 1/19 through December 31st of 2020 for all the applicants identified on the attached list who have submitted all application materials and passed background checks and inspections. Grant condition approval to the applicants listed on the attached memo, including the specific conditions mentioned.
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Janser.
Second.
Second by Alderman Olson. Discussion on the motion. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Quadrigula,
Yes.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes. Motion is approved. That takes us to 8.3, the 36th Avenue Northwest East Frontage Road median recommendation that is back before us again. This is 4071. The owner of Northgate 4th Edition, Northgate on Broadway LLC, has requested the council allow the removal of the concrete median across the east frontage road of 36th Avenue Northwest. Council requested that staff perform a traffic study at that intersection to determine the warrants of the median and potential impacts to the community. The recommendation is to leave in place the east frontage road median at the intersection of 36th Avenue Northwest and Broadway. Before, as we head into looking for a motion here, I do want to acknowledge that I have had some discussions with Mr. Marsh prior to the meeting as well, and came to the idea that we're looking for a yes and here's how mentality on this. Normally, it's not the mayor who's making the motion on this, but with discussions not only with City Manager Barry and with Mr. Marsh leading to this, came to the conclusion that the yes and here's how idea would be perhaps to remove the full median at 36th Avenue Northwest on the East Frontage Roads intersection, but also to have a performance bond issued on that for a period of 3 years following the first permit that is pulled off that development. Mr. Marsh has made the comment that the median is preventing development on that. My conditions would be to have that median removed, and 3 years after the first permit that is pulled is to have it put back in place and paid for by the owner, by the developer, and having that performance bond in place being the teeth, so in fact to ensure that we're not getting back into the sidewalks of old that were always talked about being put in but never put in when development came. With that, I would take a motion before further discussion.
Mr. Mayor, I would offer a motion that essentially outlines the terms on this particular project that you and Mr. Marsh have come to on this.
Second. Motion by Alderman Wolski, second by Alderman Straight. Lance, did Mr. Meyer, did you have some more to discuss with the motion that is before us?
No.
Okay. With that, oh, I'm sorry, City Manager Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My understanding is that there is an outstanding commitment that Mr. Marsh has that I might want to encourage the council also place as a condition of approval. That is some road improvements that I understand are still outstanding. Mr. Meyer, I think, has the specifics on that. Where did he go?
Oh, right back here.
Yeah. Mr. Meyer, would you mind informing the council of the outstanding commitment that we have? I think which would be important to consider amongst the motion as well.
Certainly, there's about $15,000 or so in paving that hasn't been completed, and we'd have to do an assessment of some of the curb and gutter. We know it's been taking some damage in the several years since the infrastructure's been installed. So just to make sure everything's A-okay with our infrastructure, should probably take a look at that and make sure that work is done.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. On that assessment, what would be your recommendation to have that assessment and second overlay prior to development to limit any further damage?
Mr. Mayor, I would recommend that that infrastructure is installed or repaired before any building permits are issued to that development.
Any questions for Mr. Meyer? Thank you, Lance.
Yeah, actually, so Lance, help me out here. I guess I'm not fully understanding what's left to be done.
Yeah, certainly. Mr. Mayor, Alderman Wolski, when the development was installed several years ago, the frontage road had to have some utility and street improvements done to it. So this would be the frontage road from 36th Avenue, probably 600 feet to the north. And so there's curb and gutter installed, a couple catch basins, and there's supposed to be 2 lifts of asphalt pavement, which is pretty typical for our streets. It's still missing that top 1.5 inch layer of asphalt. And it's been like that for 3 or 4 years now. So over time, without that last lift of asphalt, the street starts to deteriorate. Our curb and gutter gets banged up from snow plows because they don't have that edge or that pavement edge to protect the toe of the curb. So there could be some curb damage that we should probably have taken care of.
Alderman Patergula.
Yeah, I wanted to get a little bit of clarification. I'm not quite sure I understand the motion. To be very frank, I originally was not keen on having the median there. And I was concerned about the impact on the property owner. And my driving experience with these medians has not been positive. I've almost run into them on several occasions. So I've not been a fan of those, and I was intending to want to see us remove that. However, I read the very detailed 27-page summary that the engineering department prepared, and that convinced me that the median really was necessary. I think certainly it clogs up the intersection in a way, and I think there are some problems with it. If you're going north on Broadway, for example, you have to go to the next block and then double back, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If we get rid of the median and allow easier access to the property, I think there may be some other alternatives. But I guess I'm a little concerned. I guess I want a clear explanation of what we're being asked to consider. And I also want a sense from the engineering people as to, their opinion on this. Because I know as part of the 27-page report, your staff consulted with state engineers, and there's a very lengthy list of things that were done. And before I can, vote my original intent to get rid of the median, I guess I want some reassurance that that really is the best thing from an engineering standpoint.
Well, Mr. Mayor, Alderman Padragula, we had a presentation ready, but I don't think we'll have to go into that. Right. But I guess the engineering staff we're not in favor of removing the median for many reasons. Safety is paramount, of course. It's not only my engineering staff and myself, but the DOT's engineers that concur that removing that median isn't a wise idea for safety. There's a access easement that goes through the development that was platted specifically for this reason, so vehicles can get in and out of the development without using the frontage road. Then the median's installed to help protect and clean up the intersection. These frontage roads they're a burden on the city. And then so as we've been developing roadways, we've been trying to correct that. But, that was a mistake, I guess, done back in the 70s and 60s, and just depending on where the plat occurred at the time. So there's only a certain finite number of tools we have to correct this. One of them is platting access easements through developments like we did here with this one, or like down by Cashwise, that's the same concept where you have a collector roadway in the middle of all that commercial development that funnels the traffic in and out, so you don't have all the accesses on a 16th Street or 31st Avenue. So we're trying to apply those principles to increase our capacity on our arterials, but then also limit access so that it's more safe for drivers. So
am I correct then in saying that your safety engineering professional judgment would be that the median would be helpful?
Correct.
Okay. Thanks. And could I ask then for clarification of I didn't understand the motion.
Sure. Alderman Patergula and the rest of the council, the motion is to remove the median entirely, mainly for the purpose of access into that property for development, but also rather than splitting it for snow removal, so that there becomes a lot more, easily maneuverable through that area with snow removal. The issue, as the applicant, Mr. Marsh, has said, is that the median is preventing development from in that area. The idea behind the 3 years for removal is to, one, get the property developed, two, create the, assumed consumer mind training that you see in some of the other areas of the community that develop. For instance, with the medians that were over by on 31st on KFC and over by the Home Depot that weren't there when they originally developed and were put in once those counts became an issue, and safety, of course, being paramount with that. And I couldn't agree that safety is an issue here that we have to weigh on this very considerably. I'm looking for a way on yes, and here's how. So as traffic count gets to a point, we had looked at, considered perhaps on taking a look at crash baseline percentages and a whole lot of other time-consuming and expensive processes. 3 years seemed a bit arbitrary, but also enough time for that area to develop enough to perhaps see a traffic count that would mirror those areas that are referenced over by Home Depot and others. So that is only then also the reasoning behind, but also the inclusion of that $50,000 performance bond, so that 3 years down the road, that there is a surety that the developer has the money and will pay to have that median put back in.
So if I understand this correctly, it's just a chance to see how it goes. And that was one of the weaknesses, I think, of the traffic study, is that, we have no data, very little data, because of the light just having been put in fairly recently. So if I understand it correctly, Mayor, you're suggesting we take a time out and gather some data for 3 years and see what happens. And if the median is necessary, we can put it in and we have assurance it'll be paid for by the developer. Is that correct?
That is correct, with one caveat. Alderman Pontragula, the 3 years is from the first building permit to be pulled. If the building permit isn't pulled, then we do not have the surety to have the developer go and put that back in. I want that to be clear to the council, is that the motion was 3 years from the time that the building permit is pulled.
Meaning taken out?
Taking out, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Meyer, can you speak to the most recent aspect of the overlay and the additional curb work that has to be done? And my common sense says, why would we put that in now before a developer is going to possibly build on that site and damage it? Why wouldn't we wait? Can you speak to that?
Well, I guess,
and knowing full well that I recognize that maybe there's no development that happens. So
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Straight, that can happen. I guess my concern is, at this point, after 3 or 4 years, if the pavement isn't there, it's probably not going to be there in the future. So at some point, if that roadway continues to deteriorate, then the total bill's on us. So I would rather, if it was me, try to get it protected and get that additional 1.5 inches of pavement on, just to help prolong the life of that pavement.
Alderman Straight, continue.
Mr. Mayor, if I could ask, maybe now, Mr. Marsh, do you agree with that staff finding, that you have that outstanding aspect that has to be dealt with? Yeah. Please, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Councilman Straight. Yes, we realize that is our commitment. It's the last lift, I guess, is the terminology for this. As our city manager articulated, we understand we're responsible for that. We didn't put that in until our intent was until we have development there, we've got permits pulled, we've got some users, because then it's nice and fresh. If you go up and look at the property now, that curb and gutter is not deteriorated at all. Effectively, there really isn't any traffic on that frontage road anyway. Frankly, the city of Minot should go and pay for the rest of the frontage road all the way up to that motel, because it's just gravel and mud and people get stuck up there if they try to go through. But to specifically answer your question 100%, we will pay for that last lift, and we'll do it when we pull our permits and when we get that first user. Hopefully we'll get that first user and get rolling.
Thank
Does
you,
that
Mr.
answer your
Marsh.
question?
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Any questions for Mr. Marsh while he is at the podium? Alderman.
Mr. Mayor, I just think that Mr. Wolski has to amend his initial intent language, so my second confers with what Mr. Barry is asking us for.
Okay. Alderman Wolski, is that
Let's just
intention?
hold for a little bit. I know Alderman Janser had some comments, so I'd like to hear the rest of the council's comments.
I just had a question clarifying. So the motion, so the removal of the median is being paid for by who under this motion? By the developer or by the city?
On the removal, the initial discussion is that the city might look at it, but with outstanding cost, or with that outstanding overlay, Mr. Marsh, I think it would be prudent to have the developers pay for that, seeing as, and I know we talked about it differently, but with that 15,000 in still outstanding from the original development, I would see that as a cost with the developers. And you can disagree with me if you would so choose.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, the last lift on the pavement, Lance and I had that discussion probably 2 or 3 years ago, and it hasn't changed. I mean, I told him back then that we would live up to our word and we would put that in when we do our development. Relative to the median that was put in by the city, per our discussions, I would really appreciate all of you from the city's perspective paying to remove that, and I will pay to put it back in. And I will post that surety bond to put that back in. And that bond would be posted with the city. We'll have to meet with the city attorney and such, and I have no idea what those cost, but I mean, I would sit down with you and we would post that at that time so that you have the affirmation from us that we will pay for that.
Alderman Janser.
Just to follow up on that question I asked. So then, if under this motion the city is to pay for removing the median, where are those funds intended to come from?
Alderman Janser, I would likely have to look to our city manager to see if we do have any of those funds inside, but more so what the cost of that would be.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I believe, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to look for a head nod here. We talked about removal being somewhere in maybe the $6,000 to $7,000 range. Is that correct?
Mr. City Manager, I think it'll be a little bit higher than that. We'd have to do a takeoff on removing the whole thing and then patching it back in.
But what would you, I mean, probably not to exceed something like 11?
Yeah, I'd say 15 to be safe.
15. So we would have to look inside the 2019 budget to see, I mean, I'm assuming that's when we'd want to have this removed, if there's money in the budget to do that. If not, we might have to come back for a budget amendment to the city council. I'll have to get with the engineering staff, review the budget, and just identify. We weren't anticipating the removal to come at the city's expense, so I'm unprepared to discuss if we have that money available. It's possible, but we'd have to spend a little time looking at that.
Thank you, City Manager Barry. With that, to answer your question, Alderman Janser, and looking at Mr. Marsh here, I'm trying to find a way on yes and here's how. And we have already spent a significant time talking about the reason why it was put in there for safety, and to have the DOT and to have the city engineer talk about the reasons why it's there. I don't know if I can look to the city taxpayers to say, if it's another $11,000 to assist with that, but I would look to the rest of the council to see if it is within the will of the full council on the yes and here's how for the $11,000. I personally, for full consideration, seeing as this has only been a short time in discussion, at least for me, from the time of our meeting, I would look to the development, seeing as we do still have outstanding cost within that overlay. And you have said that you would do it once the development starts. But with that was the original commitment also made when that development started. So the intention would be then, Mr. Marsh, to look to the developers to pay for that removal.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, that's fine. I mean, we have to get past the hill on this. I want to say publicly, all of you have been great to listen to our cause. You've got bigger fish to fry than a median that's up on North Hill. But for us, it's significant because we've got to get some development going on North Hill. We don't have anything on North Hill, folks. I mean, you can't go to a gas station and get food. I mean, we've got to get some development up there. So, and just as a clarification, when we did do the traffic study for the city, back in 2015, Ackerman did that for us and for the city. There was no medians contemplated at all at that time. But having said that, if it helps us get over the hill, we will pay to have that removed in its entirety. We will also post a surety bond with the city attorney so that we will put it back in 3 years after the first permit is pulled. And at that time, when that permit is pulled, we will do that final lift on the pavement. And if you want to add that into the surety bond, that's fine. Just so that you have a commitment from the private sector that those 3 components are fulfilled from our end, we'll do that.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Mayor?
Alderman Janser, did you have any follow-up on that?
I was just going to say
Alderman
that as the maker of the original motion, the terms that Mr. Marsh has outlined there, I'm comfortable with. I think there's an element of compromise in there. We were probably all, a perfect world sees us hoping for that lift sooner. Obviously, I heard our city engineer express that desire, but I think this is a pathway forward. So I'm willing to support this.
Second agree.
Completely.
Thank you, Mr. Marsh. Any further discussion on the motion before us? Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, thank you. I love the fact that we're getting to yes on this. Philosophically speaking, and on sort of a larger holistic sense, there's an issue here that I think we just need to be mindful of in the future, particularly our engineering department, our public works department, is that when we are developing and expanding and improving areas, it's my opinion that I want the city infrastructure to be, and this is impossible to do in every circumstance, I get that, but I want our city infrastructure to be just a little bit lagging. I think this is an example of where our infrastructure was a little bit ahead of the larger development in the area, and as a result, it created some issues. And I think there's some logic in attempting to do things that way. It allows for the world to unfold in a more orderly fashion. But I think we have to acknowledge that this stuff isn't always going to be pretty. There's going to be a lot of chaos involved. It's not always going to be orderly. And as a way to sort of prevent or give ourselves the best chance of minimizing these types of mistakes, if our infrastructure is just a little bit behind what the private sector needs us to be, I think we have a better chance of arriving at the finish line where we want to be there. So I just wanted to add those comments.
Further discussion on the motion. City Manager Barry.
Thank you,
You look
Mr.
like you
Mayor.
had something to say.
Well, I just want to make sure we're really clear on this, and I think we're there. But we did hear a number of $50,000 for the performance bond, and we're not clear if that's in the motion or not. I don't believe it was included in the motion, but it was discussed during deliberation. That, I think, was an estimate for the work to install the median. And then in the inclusion of the $15,000 of outstanding work for the paving, curb and guttering work would be $65,000 as a total performance bond. I just want to make sure, is that correct? And maybe I'll look to Mr.
No idea.
Yeah.
Where'd you come up with 50,000?
Well, I think in talking with engineering, the city's installation cost several years ago was close to $30,000.
For both sides. Sorry. For the median, I believe, Mr. Marsh. And so with escalating costs, associated with inflation and those kinds of things, and not knowing a time certain for when the median might go back in if you don't pull permits for 10 years or if you don't pull permits for 3 years. I mean, we have no idea what the escalating costs are going to be. The idea was something around to give a coverage factor for how much it might cost to replace that. Certainly, if it costs less than that, that's great. But to have some insurance that the city wouldn't be stuck carrying any portion of the bill, an estimate of around $50,000. I heard the mayor mention that also during the deliberation process. I didn't know if that was something the two of you discussed or not. But I just want to be clear about the amount because that's important. And then if we included the $15,000 of the second lift on some curb work, that would make a total of $65,000 in performance bond. And then that would be
of course, after this motion, the bond would go into place now and be held until 3 years after the first building permit, is my understanding. I just want to make sure we've got that clear, because that's a,
The original, City Manager Barry and Mr. Marsh, the original comments that I had made was at 50,000 in regards to the original cost plus inflationary, again, with time frame. To take a look at that second lift, it would be adding that 15 to that total of 65,000 for a surety bond.
And Mr. Mayor, Mr. Berry, when do you want that posted?
well,
Towards the city attorney, but she's, sorry.
I think, Mr. Marsh, it would probably be prudent within 90 days. And then with that, we could likely take a look at getting the scope of work taken care of to remove the median.
Okay. Sounds reasonable.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that.
I'm comfortable with the
First,
motion reflecting
second.
that number.
Agree.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. If I could just make one footnote to it,
Please.
Mr. Mayor. The people that we've dealt with and gave us pricing on all these kind of things there is Bernie Beater Construction. They do a lot of work. They did a lot of our infrastructure work. I know they do work for the city. For essence of time, I'd like to be able to hire them to remove the median so that, we can get fair pricing and get that out professionally. You okay with that, Mr. Berry?
I would have to defer to Mr. Barry here.
yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Marsh, you're free to hire whoever you'd like, since it's going to be your money.
Yeah.
We just want to coordinate with our traffic and engineering department to make sure we get the right-of-way agreements and those types of things, temporary construction agreements and stuff to have that work done. But you can hire whoever you like, whenever you like.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
We have a first and a second with a lot more clarity. Further discussion. Alderman Janser.
Okay, one more clarification. So the performance bond goes in place before the median gets pulled out. Is that an
Correct.
accurate timeline description?
Correct.
Mr. Mayor, that would be preferable. However, I don't believe that's what's been reflected right now. You can condition as one more condition that be the case, so that we have in place the performance bond prior to the work being done. I don't think, Mr. Marsh, we've set 90 days as an issuance for the bond, so as long as we get the bond within the 90 days, your concern is satisfied, I think, Alderman Janser, but I don't believe we've set that as a requirement.
Well, I guess everybody trusts everybody, but it seems to me like once the median is pulled out, is taken out, if our intention is to ensure that it can be put back in when we want it to be put back in, then we better have that bond in place, it seems like to me.
City Manager Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is very much the negotiation of a developer's agreement that we're in the middle of. So with your approval, Mr. Wolski and the second's approval of that condition, we'll just include that. We'll write it all up into a developer's agreement. We'll have Mr. Marsh sign the agreement, the city sign the agreement. It'll be very clear. And then it gives you one last opportunity to look at it all before it gets ratified, if you will. How's that sound?
Please, Mr. Marsh.
Sorry to just kind of run back and forth. I apologize, Mr. Mayor and Mr. Mayor and Mr. Berry. I would prefer that it be voted on tonight. You have my word that we will take out obviously we want to take out the median. We will post the surety bond, and we will do that when the median comes out, so you have assurances that it's in place. And, we want to get rolling. So I would prefer a vote tonight and get this done so that we can move forward.
Alderman Wolski, are you fine with adding that verbiage to the motion?
I'm not sure I am, Mr. Mayor. I think ultimately what we have here is a 3 years from the point at which the permit was pulled. So that would have been sort of my understanding that is when the performance bond sort of takes effect, because it may not happen, right? And the presumption is that under its current state, there isn't an extraordinary, the media can go either way. And so it's at a judgment call right now, and in its current condition with the development of the property in its current state, I don't see it as ultimately necessary. It's important for me that the median be a part of the condition that comes back into play as the property develops. So it's not just that I need 3 years from now to have a median back in. There's a little latitude in this process that I think is ultimately reflected in the motion that we have. I'm comfortable supporting the terms that we have right now, but I also know that if there are some additional terms that need to be worked out sort of to really clarify and provide the responsibilities in the right places, then I would trust staff to do the due diligence on that. I do want to get this moving.
Alderman Pittner.
Thank you, Mayor. What would be the process for taking on the median? Would they have to pull a permit, a construction permit that would have to be approved or ratified in some way before the work could begin?
With that process, just, Mr. Meyer, if you would, just being able to work with our city engineering staff for that removal, if you would just elaborate.
Certainly, Mr. Mayor, we would require what we call a right-of-way permit. In that permit, it shows the scope of work. They have to supply a traffic control plan to us, talk about when they're going to do the work, which is important because we have a North Broadway project taking place right now. So if our project and his project coincide, that entire quadrant of 36th Avenue would be shut down. So we have to time all that correctly.
Continue.
Thank you, Mayor. The reason I bring that up is, do we have another hurdle that has to be jumped that we can maybe provide ourselves a little protection that maybe that permit could be delayed or whatnot if for some reason the surety bond wasn't placed within the 90 days if work were to start sooner?
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Pittner, if I understand your question, they couldn't proceed with the work in the right-of-way until the permit's issued. So if we don't have the bond or things aren't where they should be, then we wouldn't issue the permit yet.
Just really quick, Lance, would that given time frame also be a given time frame, again, if we want to get to yes, but still be able to answer the questions within this developers agreement? We're still talking about a little bit of time through that right-of-way. I think we could find a way to yes through that. And I know you said you wanted to vote, but developers agreement, while coinciding with trying to work through that process, to me it seems like we've got about that time frame that we're going to be able to work through that and still get the final agreement in place with a vote tonight to move it forward, but to also bring it back for the final ratification for that developers agreement plus the permits.
Can I make a comment, please? You can stay up here with me, Lance. Okay. Mr. Mayor, Mr. Barry, Council, I'll say it one more time. We will put up the surety bond before we take out the median. Okay, so we can do development agreements till till the cows come home. The bottom line is we will post the bond before we take out the median. So the city, you don't have any downside to that effect that we will do the last lift, and we'll put in the median 3 years after the first permit is pulled. I mean, we can't make it any simpler than that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Marsh.
Thank you.
Further questions? Alderman Pontegulo.
Just a comment, I like the idea of us being able to reach a compromise. Like I say, I've never been a fan of these medians, but if we have one in, if it inhibits development, I think we need to do that to reach some sort of compromise. The thing that troubles me a little bit, though, is the fact that we're going against a staff recommendation. Staff has had several months to look at this. We asked them to do a study. They did a very thorough study, based on somewhat limited data, but still a good study and a lengthy study. And they consulted with organizations outside the city. And I feel a little awkward going in a direction that's against their professional judgment. it is ultimately our decision. And I think, getting to yes is an important issue, and facilitating economic development in a part of town that has not had it is also a very desirable and important issue. But I just want to make sure that the message doesn't get out that our actions are in any way kind of capricious or arbitrary, and that we think carefully when we do go against staff suggestions. I'm willing to do that here for a greater good. But I also want us to be mindful. Josh earlier raised the issue of, the city perhaps being a little bit more flexible and behind the pace of development to not have these kinds of problems in the future, and to kind of learn from what's happening. I want to raise a similar issue, and that issue being, asking us to think twice when we go against a staff recommendation, particularly a well thought out one and a researched one. So I'm willing to support this motion, but just having laid that out.
Further discussion? Please call the roll.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Straight.
Yes.
Motion is approved. To 8.4, the Ann Street Bridge Engineering Report and Presentation 4385. Last year, the council authorized the engineering department to study the condition of the Ann Street pedestrian bridge and report findings to the city council. Mr. Meyer, welcome back to the podium.
Yeah, evening, Mr. Mayor. So with us tonight, we have Mr. Jay Clevin. He's the structural engineer who works for A2S. They teamed with EAPC on this condition assessment. And so I thought it was important for Mr. Clevin to come here tonight just to walk you through the report, break down some of the structural terms that we have in there, and then help you all understand kind of what the condition is. And then from that, we can start formulating thoughts and ideas of where we want to go with this project in the future. So I'll turn it over to Jay, and then if you have any questions for myself or Jay after the presentation, please let us know.
Thanks, Lance.
Good evening.
Good evening, everybody. Bear with me here as I learn how to drive the car a little bit. How do I advance slides? There we go. Okay. All right. As Mr. Meyer introduced ourselves, I'm the structural engineer who was fortunate enough to look at this structure that I've driven my bike on probably 1,500 times. It's quite a task as a little 6-year-old little fella with a 1-speed fixie to go over that bridge. So I say that as a person, but as an engineer, I'm here to give a factual report. I was the structural engineer, and this really is a structural engineering task. I was under contract to EAPC for this endeavor. They had to address the State Historical Preservation Organization, as well as ADA compliance and those things that fortunately turned out pretty well, as we'll get into in this report. But you're dealing with very emotional sort of, maybe I'll use the word irrational, but nobody's irrational on these things. So I got the easy part. I just got to kind of look at a structure and take measurements. It's generally easier than dealing with people. No offense to any people in the room. So some terminology, in reading the report after the fact and after talking to Lance, kind of realized it was maybe kind of jargony. A lot of terms that are, to a structural engineer, are obvious, but I didn't really write it very well towards the audience. So we'll kind of rectify that here tonight. We'll go into some of the specific conditions that were observed. Won't go into the full laundry list. It's already going to get to be a little dry on this topic, so I didn't figure that anybody needed any more. We'll talk about budgeting. More importantly, the overall cost assessment and opinion of cost is in the report. But after the fact, it seemed wise to put together some phasing. Take a large chunk and sort it down into smaller pieces that maybe provide some flexibility in decision-making. That's always welcome. And it turns out there's some very easy ways to phase this, and we'll get into that here. That's new information, not in the written document. And then lastly, open it up to questions. As mentioned, Gloria Larsgaard from EAPC is here. To summarize the architectural effort on this, it's not ADA compliant. The ramps are too steep. To summarize the historical perspective on this, the State Historical Preservation Organization has no concerns with what's proposed. We're essentially, replacing like, kind, and quality here. On the ADA, we do have to add handrails at each ramp, which is a very moderate concession to keep a non-compliant ramp in service for public occupancy. Those costs are itemized in the opinion of probable costs that was part of the report. Architecturally is a pretty clean bill of health, all things considered. We'll define the sections: ramp, stair, bridge, upper landing. This diagram hopefully starts to do that for everybody. The ramp is the south end, if you will. That is the primary public access to it. The upper landing is at the far west end of that, the highest point of the ramp, which is also the common landing with the southwest stairs, which obviously are on the southwest corner of this structure. Within that stair, there's an intermediate landing that is a temporary landing spot, if you will, as you progress up the different stair risers on that southwest corner. And then the bridge is the all-encompassing term for the main span that goes from the upper landing all the way north, all the way landing on the other side of the main river channel. There is a ramp on the north end, but just for simplicity of terminology, that's just that north end is all incorporated into the bridge section itself under that single common term. Maybe more confusing where the individual members appear, a bent, and what their members are. The bent is really just those assemblies of structural components that provide the primary support, both for weight acting vertically and also to keep this thing from swaying side to side. The base runner is the very bottom runner on that. That's actually what transmits loads to the ground. Underneath there, and not visible in any photos, there's 3 concrete piers underground that are in direct contact with that base runner. Reference to that's made in the larger report and also in specific line items within the cost assessment. The items that form a cross, when taken as a pair, that's the cross bracing. That's what resists wind load. Wind acting horizontally, that cross bracing gets that load down into the footings, in this case down into the piers. The beam, the top member of each bent is circled there with a white ellipse. That's just that very top member that the bridge structure sits on. So it's that whole assembly from the top member down to the base runner that forms the bents, the pier bents. The terms are often used synonymously. There are 3 types of those. There's the concrete pier, and there's only 2 of those, one on each end of the main truss, which we'll get to next. And then there's a steel pier bent, which are the items that are constructed within the river channel. There's one of them that's on the south river bank, not in the normal water level. The rest of them are in the normal water level. So hopefully that cleans up that terminology. If not, and if I'm talking too fast, put the brakes on me and ask questions, please. Individual components, these are primarily within the bridge itself. The truss is the single through truss, main truss. It's in various reports at various terminologies, but structurally it's a truss, whatever other term we wanted to call it. Within that truss, not visible in the photo and very difficult to photograph, are the stringers, and those are wood. And those occur within each component of the truss. Wood member supporting wood, which in turn are supported by the steel truss. That span from concrete pier to concrete pier nominally is 122 feet. The steel beam, that's what occurs elsewhere on the main bridge span. It's just a hot rolled steel shape of varying depths, varying sizes. that is the primary structural element of the bridge. And then the last photo there, joists and planks. Joists occur only on the ramp. Again, for terminology, the south end. There's 5 of those, and this picture is the underside of that ramp, and you can see the planks that run across those joists. Those planks occur along the entire length of the bridge, the ramp, in their entirety. Guardrails seems obvious, but within the guardrail, there's vertical posts, and then there's 3 rails to form the actual fall protection. And then on the south ramp, there's a top rail that really is intended to be kind of a handrail. It's just not at the proper elevation, so I got to call it a top rail, not a handrail. Also in the photo here, if you can see the photo with the steel beam, it's more clearly defined, clearly noted, but I think you can kind of see how it relates to the larger photo, where the photo itself is just showing a steel beam. Also noteworthy here is the oversized washers that, I guess if you want to call any steel fastener historical, this is it. You generally don't find these in the hardware store anymore, and they actually serve a very important purpose. And as stated in the report, we just save them and reuse them. They are good. They're in good shape. There's no reason to toss them. And if you don't need to, why throw them in the waste bin? So specific items of concern, the stringers in the deck, and this is on the south ramp. Majority of those stringers are rotted. Previous reports in 98 and 2001 indicated they had some cracking, but didn't really raise a red flag. As I got in there and pulled up some of the planks, which you can do by hand because they don't fasten down anymore because the wood's in rotted shape, majority of those stringers were rotted beyond use. The guardrail, previous reports also attest to this. Majority of them are either rotted or loose or cracked and checked to such a manner that the guardrails just move to an uncomfortable level. I'm sure if I did a load test on them, it probably meets the prescribed loading for a guardrail, but at some point they just become, unacceptable for just general use, makes people kind of nervous. But regardless, the members they can't be reused. So in the report, we talk about replacing all of those guardrails. Within each of those pier bents, primarily the wood ones, there's random occurrence of individual members that are rotted. Majority of them are still usable, functional, safe. When you look at them, they look checked and warped, but that's pretty normal for wood structures. They don't cause a concern. It's just those items that are rotted, and primarily at their connection points, and almost without exception where they're in direct contact with soil. Wood in any exterior structure does well when it's allowed to dry. So if it's exposed to sun and wind and even cold and wind, those elements will dry out. It's where the dirt got piled, the landscaping, whatever, got piled against the wood inadvertently, solving whatever daily problem there was at the time. That's where we tended to see the problems. So those occur generally low, but that top member of the wood was rotted at anchorage points where water just had a chance to penetrate into the wood fibers. Again, the report does a better job of discussing that in narrative form. The steel nailer board, which we'll see in some photos here, the upper landing itself just needs to be redone. It's shifted, it's moved, its underlying structure, while still usable, needs to be replumbed and reset. The recommendation is to replace that in its entirety. That does not mean replacing the wood pier bents, just the elements that sit on top of those piers. And then the steel coatings at the water line. Those occur obviously only at the steel pier bents that are in the water line. And fortunately, the dive inspection showed no corrosion. A little bit of pitting that would be normal for steel of this age, but no loss of structural section, the thickness of individual components. So again, it's allowed to dry, and it's only in the area where the water level transitions where you generally have corrosion. And fortunately, the dive inspection didn't show any of that. So some specific photos, right? The old saying, it's worth 1,000 words. The picture on the left is one joist amongst the majority that show rot, and I've never seen this before. If you look at it from a bit of a distance and don't get underneath that ramp, you look at the side of the joist, it looks okay. A little bit of checking, but not so bad. Then you look underneath it, and I always think it looks like a dugout wood canoe. Because literally when I was able to take some of those planks off and look down in there, it was hollowed out. And there's several of them like that, but again, the majority of the joists are rotted. And that's evident also in the photo that's labeled as deck plank. We can see two of them adjacent to each other where you can see that rot. Several other planks were removed, similar observations were made. So the photo up on the top shows a joist. That would be a level of checking and a horizontal crack that could often be acceptable, but in conjunction with it occurring in many places and the direct rotting of the wood, that led to the recommendation, just replace all those elements on the south ramp. And then the deck plank pictures, you can see all of these are rotted. The ones that aren't rotted, the footfall and comfort level, especially considering we've already got a concession just to add a handrail to keep the ramps accessible, the footfall and the walking surface isn't acceptable. So again, all that leads to the conclusion just to replace the entire south ramp. Joists and plank only. The guardrail, the pictures can't do it justice. It's an attempt to do that. But when you stand on the bridge and sight down, all the guardrails are just poorly aligned, or they're loose, or they've literally fallen out. Just the alignment's poor. So again, with rotted members, misalignment, and other elements that aren't acceptable, the recommendation is to replace all the guardrail. So the picture on the left is looking along the bridge span towards downtown. The picture on the right is standing on the upper landing, looking towards the east down the ramp section. Both pictures show essentially the same conditions. Some examples of the wood members within the pier bench themselves. The base runner on the left, probably the worst condition. I mean, it's crushed to less than half of its normal thickness. That condition had been noted in previous reports. Time, of course, is no friend to problems when they're there, and those problems are just becoming worse. Next picture shows the base runner, and that kind of is running left to right in the photo with an X-brace connection at the bottom. You can see the large cracks in there. In that case, the bottom of the member is just rotted out, so that fastener really has nothing left to attach to. Similar condition occurs on the photo on the right. This one was interesting because the base runner, again, which is the element running left to right in the photo, it was rotted about a 4-inch, basically hole right to the bottom of it. Anyways, hopefully the pictures show some conditions. By no means is it a picture of every of these conditions. They're representative of the whole. The nailer board, the concept of that was a little fuzzy without a picture. That's a horizontal element laying along the entire length of the steel beams. That's actually what the deck plank gets fastened to. And it's rotted anywhere I could probe it or look at it or observe it, whether I was standing on the planks themselves or in this case standing at grade looking up. The result of that is those planks they don't hold anymore. And it is those planks that keep the structure from racking side to side, and without that connection, the structure's not doing what it should be doing. Reference is made to the upper landing. Here's a photo on the left showing, in this case, the south end. You can see at the very bottom of the photo, there's like these tails of the joist sticking out. The very lowest member of that is the top of the structure, the pier bent, if you will. That's acceptable. It's everything above that that would be replaced when we replace the landing. The photo in the middle there shows it's about a 2-inch gap that formed when that upper landing just started to shift. Everything to the right in this picture is the bridge. Everything to the left is the upper landing. The next photo is just showing some more plank and deck that are bad. A close-up of that gap. Again, maybe beating a dead horse here, but the upper landing, we've already said should be replaced. And then a couple good photos of the steel and the water line. It looks horrible until you realize that all that loose stuff is just a coating, a paint, a protectant. And the underlying steel structure is in actually very good condition. So, in all things, right, it comes down to dollars, right? That's the first questions everybody asked. This is really a snippet from the main report showing the construction cost, the direct cost as estimated, 1.267358. It's a level of precision that's a little bit maybe ambitious there. I'm pretty sure this estimate's not accurate to the nearest dollar, but when you do things right, you tend to sort them out and then round them when you're done. Roll that down to a total opinion of project cost, $1.65 million. That would include, the Division 0 contract terms, some field quality control testing, engineering, and on-site observation. So that number rolls down to 1.65. And there is a plus or minus 15 upper and lower bound. And this estimate is reliably a plus minus 15% estimate. So when talking about this number, we all like single point values, 1.65. I would recommend we always keep that range in mind because it's just too early to be any more precise than that. So we referenced some phasing options. First, we'll talk about a deduct alternate. Quite literally, the day this report was due, I got a return phone call from a colleague of mine who is a dive inspector, and he's done underwater bridge repairs. And he said, hey, you should call this guy Bobby. So usually when you get that phone call, you're a little worried about what Bobby's up to. Turns out he's had tremendous information for us. And he offered an option to encase the steel rather than do a paint. With paint, you've got to create a dry work area, and that turns out to be not inexpensive. So this gentleman, Bobby, said, well, we'll just encase it with fiberglass reinforced plastic, and then literally, his words were a little more technical. He said, we'll just squirt a bunch of gel inside there and cover the steel. Works great. So he gave me some project referrals. We checked up on it. It's legitimate. I've never used it, but it's good enough information where it has to be presented as a possible alternative technology. And going forward, obviously it needs to be reviewed, but it's an easy alternate to bid. The drawback is you end up with fiberglass wrapped around the steel piles, and it does go into the water line. It does go down into the muck line, so you get past that zone where corrosion could occur. I'd say subjectively it wouldn't be so much pretty to look at, but he assures us we can get any color we want. So, but nonetheless, there's a tremendous cost opportunity here. So you roll that down, it takes that total project cost from 1.65 to a $1.3 million. That helps a lot. So anyways, talked about phasing, and this actually came from Lance's review comments on it. And so it's a smart question. And we are able to offer some phasing options, kind of smooth out some cash flow impacts. Here's a listing of the project phases, one scenario amongst who knows how many someone could evaluate. First phase, and it is the phase that would be required to start getting the overall structure back to public occupancy. replace the south ramp inclusive of all recommendations, and replace the upper landing. Next phase, I'm just going right down the bridge, working south to north, which actually makes a lot of sense because if you work south to north, you give yourself a material staging path. So you can bring sundries up to your workers, probably bring most of the bridge planks up that way. What that does is it keeps intact a workflow that doesn't require on-grade flagging from Burlington Northern. So the thought here is all this, whether it's one project or 6 phases, the majority of the work, except for creation of initial installation of overhead construction staging, is all done overhead. BNSF has cleared that vertical clearance. They'd be comfortable with that as a construction process, which saves a lot of time, complexity, and cost. But back to the phasing. So we'd work just literally from south to north, pick off sections of the bridge from section to section. In this case, phase 2 would be from the upper landing, which has now been rebuilt, over to the south end of the main truss. You do that work. This ends up being a pretty small phase. And under this concept, the southwest stair would be in there too. Not because it has to be done at that time, it smooths out the cash flows really equally, actually. It's a nice cash flow distribution. Phase 3 would be the repair of the bridge along the BNSF truss, do everything within the BNSF truss span itself, and then you just keep working towards the north. Repair the next section of spans, repair the next section of spans, and then the last thing would be to do the steel coatings on the piers or do the encasement. I'm comfortable leaving that to the tail end just because the condition of that steel was so good. Phasing has a cost. You don't do a single project over multiple years and not have a cost penalty somewhere. The quantified elements of that cost is you will have to pay a BNSF insurance for every phase, not just one phase. Cost is not exorbitant, $7,000 for the BNSF protection with the cost of the project as it would be. Also have to do it for every project. It'd have to be traffic plans and other construction logistics that have to be created. And then, of course, there's time value of money. We're using 3% inflation, which has been a pretty common number for the last 4 to 5 to 6 years of construction sequencing. Those numbers are quantified in the phasing cost. I'm not prepared to do debt service analysis because that really is what you do when you're figuring out which project you do. There's often a staff time and opportunity cost. Lance and the engineering group will have management time to this, and I don't know how that gets quantified in project budgets, if it does at all. So that's an open item, as well as that public perception, which rarely is a direct cost, but as you folks know better than anybody, there's an indirect cost, time, complexity, and emails at 12 o'clock at night. So anyways, this is a summary of projected costs. We start with the no phasing option. Note the bottom line total projected estimated costs. I didn't do this with plus or minus 15% range just because the analysis is easier and it shows you the end result. So if you roll over to the last 2 columns, you'll see a summary of total cash, construction total, Division 0 subtotals, and then total project costs, and then the delta between those is summarized in the far right-hand column. Each of those costs from years 1 through 6, those are indexed to the year at which those costs are incurred. They are not rolled back to a net present worth or any future present worth analysis. The net present worth is really the project in year 1. So we didn't do anything more elaborate than index the cost forward to project estimated cash flows in the given year the project occurs. You'll see in the note we did use an indexing factor of 3%. Again, it's a pretty reliable number for where we're at in this, and it's what we've been using for most of our construction projects, unless there's other things that drive something different. The initial phase is indicated to be 2019 or 2020. Interestingly, when you do this at year 6, taking the rather large cost of doing the steel pier coatings as part of the project, if you roll that into year 6, the initial project budget has a work and lift premium on cost, because it's not an easy project to do as far as getting materials to and fro. But if you take that steel coating cost, put it in its own project, that percent escalator on that work access premium doesn't apply at year 6. So it had this kind of unanticipated benefit of making those Division 0 costs disproportionately less expensive by phasing it over time. So you'll see that's all explaining why that delta on that Division 0 subtotal is so small with phasing. Hopefully this is a self-explanatory graphic. If we really want to get into the weeds, the next 6 slides are everything that was used to build this single slide summary. So with your consent, I might just fast forward over them.
We can skip those 6. Yes.
I was pretty proud of the work, though. You sure don't want me to spend time on it?
I'll read it tonight before I go to bed.
All right, yes. Count sheep or read my report. Either one will do the job. The question that came up after the fact, and this came up after when we were preparing for this presentation, again, this came from Mr. Meyer, it'd be, what would be recommended in 2020 to provide full and open access? Phase 1 would probably do it, but I think adding the southwest stairs and just some miscellaneous obvious guardrail repairs on the bridge itself would be prudent. As you can see, $350,000 here is not a lot of additional cost relative to the $333,000 it was for phase 1. With all due respect to cash and other demands of the city, it's a disproportionately positive marginal benefit for not a lot of cost, if you will. That would be my recommendation, to get this open to full and public access. The other question was asked is, as opposed to the report, which was spot replacement of bridge plank on the bridge itself, because the rot really wasn't bad, the footfall was acceptable. So we just had spot repair of up to 300 bridge planks as the main part of the project. The question was asked, what would it cost to replace all the planks? They're heavy timber and they're bridge plank, and so you don't just buy those at Menards. So it would be a significant cost. Our estimate's $102,000. And that's the delta, the net cost above and beyond what the report is already indicating. And that's estimated to be 680 planks. I will admit, I have not counted every individual plank. I tried and then got a phone call, and I lost my count. So I just kind of estimated it by area. Again, within the plus minus 15% margin, it's a reliable number. And I think it does answer the question is what that delta on our costs would be if we just committed to a full replacement of all the planks. And with that, the floor is yours. I'm here to answer whatever questions that may come up.
Any questions for Mr. Clevin? Figured you would. Alderman Walski.
Yeah. Mr. Clevin, thank you for the report. I appreciate having the full picture. I'm not sure I've been over it 1,500 times, but I've been over it a lot. And I think short of Central Campus students who are commuting back and forth over that thing on a regular basis right now, I'm a regular user. A couple questions. In terms of the phasing, what would your anticipated construction times on each phase be? I mean, are we talking about having this thing out of service for a period of a month or 6 weeks over the next several years? Or, you know, if you get that significant first phase done, opportunities to use it in the interim while we're doing this stuff, if we choose to?
The full project would be a full construction season. Each individual phase, you're talking 2 months. That's on-site work, assuming we're bidding it early, right? So when the seasons come around and construction season starts, they've already ordered their goods, their equipment, they're all lined up, motors are running. It's a reliable estimate to count on 2 months of downtime.
Okay.
Continue.
I'll continue. Thank you, Mayor. I'm not sure I saw it in your report, but the main steel, and I'm probably going to get the jargon wrong, but the truss that extends from each of the uprights to each upright, when you see the pictures, it looks rough. It looks like old steel. Is there any accommodation or any reason to coat that or improve, or is that a part of what you've showed us today? And I'm thinking more along the aesthetic, but I'm sure there's some pictures here. I'll stop you when you get to it.
So,
Yep.
for example, the steel beam in that picture.
Yep.
Yeah. It's in remarkably good shape. To the small caveat, I could not get underneath these nailer boards to observe the top flange. Pretty sure we'll have to do a little bit of touch-up or spot repair. Top flange, by the way, is the very top horizontal part of the steel beam, where the nailer board's actually fastened to. There is provision for touch-up and some, what I would call the normal amount of steel just fixing any time you have exposed exterior steel. Now, that being said, it's not pretty to look at, but there is no observed corrosion or section loss that would create a structural inadequacy or degrade the capacity of the steel. It's in remarkably good
Your
shape.
recommendation would be to leave it alone? Except for the
Sometimes if
touch-ups.
it's been there that long and it's in that good a shape, maybe my intervention's only gonna hurt it.
Okay, sure.
Same comment, sir, would apply to the truss itself.
Okay.
There was no observable concerns with that.
Okay. And as a continued follow-up here, we know the bridge is not ADA accessible to the terms that the ADA prescribes today. The ramps have, too much slope, et cetera. One of the accommodations that I understand to be made in ADA concerns is when you have those circumstances that you provide relief points along the way to provide some relief, frankly. Is that the type of thing that were we to take this project on, we could try to make some nods or some improvements towards the overall ADA accessibility without rebuilding the entire ramp? And is that the type of thing that you guys, and so what I'm talking about is providing potentially some relief points along the way on that south ramp and maybe additionally on that north ramp. Is that feasible? Does that change our ADA circumstances?
Yeah, anything's feasible.
Sure.
Fortunately, on this one, there was consideration and whatever people were using as their own and by people, I mean code officials, evaluating this. The one concession they've asked is to put handrails on each of the ramps. And in this case, for purposes of ADA compliance, the definition of a ramp would be anything that, to me, is anything that has a slope that looks like a slope. In more specific terms, where we saw and measured a slope that was 5% or greater, for purposes of ADA relief, we're calling those a ramp. And what's been mandated for us is to provide simply a handrail.
Okay.
And those guardrails are guardrail height 42. Handrails are 34 inches above the walk surface. So what's an added component is handrails each side. So people have that second, I guess, point to support themselves and to help them propel themselves up the ramp.
Okay.
That's the concession that's been asked.
Alderman Wolski, if I might, I have a specific question that might lead into a whole different line of questioning on this overall project, seeing as recent discussions with Senator Hoeven that we had as the chief was here. BNSF is very highly contemplating elevating its track throughout that entire area. And if that does come to fruition, including not only having issues with 3rd Street, but Ann Street Bridge would no longer have the clearance necessary. Looking at flood control, that likely is going to be a possibility. Would any of the costs that were incurred in making improvements here, if that bridge has to be elevated, not raised, but elevated, what does that do for the structural integrity of this as it now changes substantially all of the posts, piers, and everything else?
We did talk to BNSF quite a bit, both for work, construction access, concept of the project. They haven't seen the report, but our rail expert talked to his first name basis friends in Fort Worth even. They didn't raise any red flags in the project. That doesn't mean they tell us the full story. So the fact that the track may be raised in grade, relatively new information. But to answer your question, it's definitely feasible to raise, to, in your terms, elevate it. It's feasible to do that. Once you do that, I think the ADA compliance becomes more robust, because now you are kind of changing the historic fabric of the structure, if you will. So at that point, prudence would probably dictate that we're rebuilding the south ramp to provide the refuge points, to do all the full level of ADA compliance. And once you get to that, now you're rebuilding all the underlying substructure. The wood piers, it'd be very, very challenging, and I would, at this point, my first impression would be it would not be cost feasible, technically feasible, but not cost feasible, just to add extra height on that, assuming it's anything measurable. If it's a couple inches, you can do that with spacer blocks, and that's relatively straightforward. But if it's 2 feet, now you're into rebuilding the entire substructure, pier bents and everything below the bridge elevation.
Thank you. That's some of the information I was looking for, Alderman Straight.
Mr. Mayor, for all transparency, I grew up 2 blocks away from Mr. Clevin, so Mr. Clevin and I have a history, but I know that Mr. Clevin now lives in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And so, Jay, I want you to speak to the railroad bridge, pedestrian bridge in Grand Forks, East Grand Forks, that has gone away, and what that has done to the community there as we ponder, is this feasible to spend money on it or not, compared to just your perspective on living in 2 communities where you've had historic bridges like this. If you could just add a little bit on that, I think it's important.
I'll first answer the question as the engineer who did the demolition plans on that project. Fun project. It is really interesting technical challenge, but that's not relevant. But in that capacity, I had access to Corps of Engineers and city staff and everybody who was contemplating the project and really the leaders of it. Need to take that bridge down was always somewhat nebulous. But nonetheless, it's gone. Now, in response, our community has constantly been seeking a solution to the removal of that bridge. And we still don't have it. We have a quasi sculpture in the middle of the river. Certainly creates lots of discussions, but in the end of it, it's not nearly as meaningful as that pedestrian bridge would have been. So to answer that, we don't have a good pedestrian crossing across the river. We have the Demers Avenue Bridge, which is fine. It's got sidewalks on each side, but you can't cross a bike and a pedestrian at the same time. The bike, you have to get off your bike to let a pedestrian pass by safely. Whereas the original original rail bridge then became a pedestrian bridge, you could drive a car across it. It was very wide. The deck was very accommodating for pedestrians. So all editorial aside, the basic fact of it is Grand Forks still does not have an equivalent replacement for that pedestrian bridge, not in the downtown area. You have to go about 1.5 miles up or downstream to find one that's equivalent.
Thank you, Mr. Clevin.
Any further questions for Mr. Clevin? Thank you, sir.
My
Appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Thank you for your time.
We do have a recommendation here that the council accept and file the report also to close the Ann Street Bridge until such time that necessary repairs are complete and to bring the bridge into a safe working condition.
So moved.
Moved by Alderman Olson, second by Alderman Janser.
Sure.
For discussion on this, I would just like to once again reference as contemplation over cost is moving forward, likely in that area as we further develop flood control, we would be talking, if BNSF does so choose, to elevate, as is indicated that it is considering, that elevation in that area would be in excess of 2 feet. Further discussion. Alderman Walski.
Mayor Sitma, thanks. Few comments here. It's no surprise to me that this bridge needs a lot of attention. Anybody who's been over it on a regular basis can see that very plainly. I think it raises an issue for we, the city administration, we, the city council, we the citizens of Minot, to really acknowledge the fact that I wonder if we should be building anything new when we aren't willing to maintain what we already have. This bridge has been with this community, I think, going back to 1908 or 1909, and I'll be very direct in saying I don't want to see it lost on my watch. I think we have inherited the responsibility to look after these assets, and I want to see us figure out a way to do that. I know that's not going to be easy. And obviously, when we see numbers like this, and we know what we've had to do with budgets the last couple of years, and there are no simple answers, and we've got the very complicating factor of the railroad to go with this, and the negotiations that are taking place there, which add almost an infinite layer of challenges to our ability to make decisions. At the same time, I think we need to be thinking about making some of those decisions. I also want to point out the fact that I think we're making this mistake again as we speak with another bridge in town in terms of neglecting and letting it fall into a state where repairs will be much more costly in the future if we don't address them in a timely fashion. The specific bridge I'm referencing is the 6th Street Bridge that connects Central Avenue to Eastwood Park. If you wander around in that neighborhood, you can't hardly go by it without seeing somebody there taking pictures.
For now, let's stay on Ann Street.
I'm going to stay there, but this is, I think, very relevant because I think holistically we need to identify these assets and we need to make sure that we're looking after them. And we've got a clear case with the Ann Street Bridge of this particular project really looking pretty painful as a result of not providing the timely maintenance that it desperately needed. So with that, Mayor, that concludes my comments. I want to see us address the 6th Street Bridge. I want to see us look holistically at these problems. I also want to offer an amendment here that we take this information that Mr. Clevin has provided to us and pack it into a capital improvement project that can be added to the capital improvement plan.
We have an amendment on the floor. Is there a second?
Mr. Mayor, can I add some additional language to that amendment?
Why don't you give it a second if you want to do
Give it a second.
Okay, I'll give you a second first.
We have a motion to amend by Alderman Walski, a second to amend by Alderman Straight. Alderman Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess keeping all things kind of big picture that we're working towards, we're going to build a gathering space. This came up as we talked about flood protection, flood walls along 3rd Street Bridge. This is something I've been adamant about because we're talking about this idea of resiliency and what it means. We have another political subdivision in town that has 800 kids in kindergarten. They're going to have a discussion about what's going to happen with Central Campus. Is it going to become a middle school where kids are going to be walking to school more frequently? In which case, this bridge, I think, takes on added importance. So I think within that, my additional language that I would like to see added is to maybe go back to Mr. Clevin, and if, Mr. Mayor, what I heard you correctly saying is if it's going to be elevated 2 feet, and we were going to have to add some elements to the the initial phasing, the ramp and accessibility, maybe that's something that we could be added into the initial capital improvement discussion that Mr. Wolski is asking for, which could also be then a phase approach that could get us to having this open and accessible and usable as we continue to hash out what is ultimately going to be longer-term BNSF, Third Street Bridge, elevation discussion. To Mr. Wolski's point, I think if we're going to sit here and have this bridge closed for, it could be 5-6 years, I'm going to just say conservatively, I don't think anybody wants that. So that's my point, sir. I'll stand down.
I think Alderman Straight and Alderman Wolski, to that point, I would also say if we are adding this to a capital improvement project, we don't know what that, the time frame is with BNSF. We do have a rough estimate. However, without knowing really the direction quite yet, we're getting closer to what that is, but not understanding what the difference of 18 inches or possibly 3 feet could substantially change the outcome of what that overall cost would be. I think it would be perhaps premature to allocate significant dollars until we finally get at least, I think, even a more or a less blurry picture on what it is that we're looking at.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, and I appreciate Alderman Straight's comments, and because, and yours as well, because there's so much uncertainty attached to the entire project, especially as it's related to, what may be required for a raise, and do we have a partner with BNSF that's a meaningful partner in terms of sharing the cost? There's so many questions that we simply don't have answers to that I wouldn't. I guess I wouldn't support getting specific with what's in the capital improvement plan. We have a very clear opinion of cost here. We have a clear demonstration of need. And as far as I remember, I'm not sure that this particular project is in the plan, or if it is, it certainly doesn't have the specifics attached to it. And I think in my opinion, or my recollection, we have items in the capital improvement plan that are not specifically programmed for funding in the next 1, 2, or 3 years, but they're there as a reminder of the things that sit in front of us and the challenges we have to encounter. And so it is in that light that I offered this particular amendment, because I think we need to be able to be looking at these things on a regular basis, and the budget's our most annual opportunity to do that.
Further discussion on the amendment. City Manager Barry.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't necessarily have comments on the amendment, but just to Mr. Wolski's comment, we can certainly add it to the capital improvement plan in its current form, which Mr. Clevin has provided for us, and then just also denote in the project that there could be subsequent change to the elevation of the bridge, which would essentially render a whole renewal of the project and the estimates and all that sort of stuff, but at least get it on the list. I mean, I think which is what you're requesting, and it probably wouldn't rate very high at this point in time because of that uncertainty, but at least it would be on the list. It'd be on the city's radar, and we can keep it on that list and until such time it becomes a reality for the city.
Alderman Straight, further discussion on the amendment.
Mr. Mayor, I guess my rationale in asking Mr. Clevin about Grand Forks is we're going to experience this now. We're going to shut this thing down, and folks are going to have to go to Broadway, and they're going to go over 3rd Street. And all of us up here are going to get the communication. And I think the longer it's going to sit on the capital improvement plan, and the more it's not utilized, it's easier for it to just kind of fall further and further and further out of disarray until we get to a point where maybe there's a different number of folks sitting up here where we just lose the appetite. And that's to remember, to Mr. Wolski's point, the assets that we have that make this community unique, because when they go away, they're gone. And there are some great historical elements here in town, and I know they're costly, and I know there'll be people that'll call me tomorrow and say, it's absolutely ridiculous that you're talking about $1.6 million for a pedestrian bridge. However, it's part of the historical significance that makes it unique. I think it adds to the age demographic that is continually young and wanting to be outside and active. And I think it sends a strong message to the community that we are at least going to continue to discuss how we can fund it and keep it moving forward without letting it fall in disarray. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Further discussion on the amendment? For reference, we are voting on adding it to the capital improvements plan, correct? Please call the roll on the amendment.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
Yes.
Janser?
Yes.
Olson?
No.
Pittner?
Yes.
Padragula?
Yes.
Straight?
Yes.
The amendment is passed. Now we are back to the original amended motion. Further discussion on the amended motion. Alderman Olson.
I just have a question about how the public is being kept off of this bridge at this time. If it's unsafe for pedestrian traffic, how is it blocked? Is that message out to the public, that kind of thing?
City Manager.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I see Mr. Jonason standing up, our Public Works Director. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but while you're approaching, we're essentially blocked off each end of the N Street Bridge so that people can't access the bridge. Unfortunately, people continue to go over the barricades and climb up onto the bridge. We've had people take pictures up there. We have groups of folks up there that shouldn't be up there. I'll turn it over to Mr. Jonason since he's got the podium now. You can expand where I leave off here.
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Olson, the bridge has been closed for quite some time for the flood work that's going on there. And right now, we've just had barricades there. But if the council takes action tonight, we will look at doing a more permanent type of closure to it, because there are still people going across it and using it and coming into the construction zones, which also isn't very safe. Mm-hmm. So we would have to look at some other type of fencing or something on there to keep people off it completely.
Okay, good. I want to keep the public safe, and we've got lots of media here in the room too, and hopefully they'll share that message as well.
Mr. Mayor, if I may.
Alderman Wolski.
Thank you. Dan, I was down at the Starving Rooster in the afternoon on Saturday, and I noticed that we had gotten some public commentary on the bridge being closed, which was the fact that the sign had been pushed over and kicked into the street. And so I say that sort of as a joke, but also very seriously, that when we see people going around our barriers, they are sharing public input with us. That is not the traditional input by which we typically take it and ask for it, but there are messages being sent in these actions, and I think it would be prudent for us to acknowledge them. In that also sense, I question, we put up the sign, the bridge is closed, but to what degree are people going to continue to try and go over it regardless? And do we create more significant and substantial hazards by working extremely hard to keep it closed? I think that's a question, Mr. Barrier, for you and your staff and Mr. Jonason to wrestle with. I don't have an opinion on it, and I trust your guys' judgment to do it. But I do, like I said, I looked out at that sign tipped over in the street, and I took that as a direct comment from somebody who said they want to walk on that bridge.
I would only follow that up, Alderman Wolski, with walking over that bridge is directly into a major construction zone right now, and whatever that message is, it's poorly said, because they are walking into an area that they should not be, regardless of whether that's flood control or any other major construction zone. So I would very strongly urge those folks that are doing that to strongly rethink their actions.
I think that's a prudent message, sir. Yeah.
Alderman Pittner.
Thank you, Mayor. I have no issue with adding this to the capital improvement project. I think it is prudent to try to preserve our history and to preserve these landmarks if we are able to do that at a financial with the financial means we have at our disposal. But look at those pictures, you guys. I wouldn't let my kids walk on that bridge. I wouldn't walk on that bridge. I wouldn't if I bought a house with a deck like that. I mean, would you really feel comfortable? It would be one of the first things I'd pull off. So there are things that need to be addressed to that. I'm okay with keeping it on the radar. I don't, but I don't see the common sense to invest in it at this point, to just be told maybe 2 years, maybe 6 months after the project is done, to say, hey, you guys got to tear it down. Hey, you guys got to raise it up, and all that work is sunk costs at that point. I think when it comes to safety and some of those things that we're looking at, and the message, like I say, of someone, my kids run out into the street without looking both ways too. It's an easier thing to do. It saves them time. It's more convenient, but it's not the right thing. It's not the safe thing to do. So I'm in favor of closing the Ann Street Bridge and waiting until we have a clearer picture. And we've all heard the commentary from individuals who rebuilt after the flood, only to say, I was told to go back home and invest and recover my home, and now you're buying me out, or now you need my house for flood protection. Let's not make the same. Let's learn from our past. Let's learn from history that maybe we need to have a clearer picture of what's going on before we move forward with spending millions of dollars potentially on a project like this. Just my 2 cents. Like I say, those pictures to me, and I think to anybody, should be alarming. There's literally rotting wood holding up a bridge that we're allowing our children and family members to walk on. I'd love to see it stay. I want to see it stay. I want to see it be a part of our community and to be utilized. Little known fact, I've never actually walked on that bridge. And maybe there was, maybe my parents never would let me. I'm not sure. I can't remember, but that's just my thoughts. I wanted to put those out there.
Any further discussion on the amended motion? Please call the roll.
Olson?
Yes.
Pittner?
Yes.
Padragula?
Yes.
Straight?
Yes.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
Yes.
Janser?
Yes.
Motion is approved. That takes us to section number 9 in our city council meeting tonight. The department reports, the Human Resource Director. Good evening.
Good evening. I'm going to disclose I'm more of a people person and less of a report person, so this is going to be brief and colorful. The Human Resource Department. Our department is actually one of the smallest departments in the city. Just to give you an overview of our staff that are in the department, there is myself. I do have one human resource generalist who is predominantly working in the compensation and benefits area. Her name is Lori Davis. Brittany Ballantyne, who is sort of our social butterfly, is our recruitment and testing specialist, so she does very well in that. And then last year, you did approve that I hire an additional staff member for the training and development. And so this year in April, we were lucky to find Camilla Van Dyke, who is doing our training and development. We again are four full-time staff that oversee all the personnel issues, including administration of the compensation and benefits. Our staff of 420 plus employees and 25 part-time plus employees, and then also 270 active pensioners. With regard to employee compensation and benefits, ours is sort of a repetitive process, but it is a process that does take a while most of the time. Our process is 4 to 5 payrolls per cycle per month. We do 2 cycles for active employees, 1 cycle for pensioners, and 1 cycle for council members. Our active employee cycle for payroll generally takes us about 2 to 3 days to complete, basically because most of our stuff is done manually. So with the help of the administrative assistants in the various departments, we do manually enter time. Time cards are still being utilized, so that's something that we hopefully will be looking at getting away from in the future. We also do administer the benefits for all of our active employees. Those benefits do include health insurance, dental and vision, life, long-term disability. This year we added flexible spending medical and dependent care accounts, voluntary benefits. We have an employee assistance program, and also vacation and sick leave. Now, when we say administer, we are also assisting our employees, so if they do have any issues with regard to claims, we will actually call the insurance companies to assist with claims administration. So if there's something that's just not working out very well, we do assist in that way as well. And then for administering benefits and pay for our pensioners, we're a little bit more complicated than most municipalities because we do have 3 different pensions that we actually pay benefits for. So not only do we pay those benefits, we have to calculate the 3 different types of pension benefits. For our active employees, we have those 3 different pension benefits. We also have a defined contribution pension. We do have an ND PERS defined benefit pension that was started this year. And then we do offer the option for those individuals to participate in a deferred compensation account. So our retirement is very complicated for a city of our size. Also with our employee benefits and compensation, we try and be competitive with other municipalities, and we every year do a market salary and benefits survey. Now, our process for the Human Resource Department for budget actually begins in February. That's when we send out our surveys to the various municipalities. We generally send out 16 to 17 comparables surveys to comparable municipalities and counties, and we also include some regional private sector data for that. Our survey is usually about 17 pages long. It does encompass surveying approximately 1/3 of our positions, approximately 60 positions. We do have 150 plus positions in our system. The data is compiled, and then every year we do present that information to the Civil Service Commission. We present it separately to an employee representative committee, and then also to the public. And this year, our public presentation is going to be on June 27th. I do please encourage you to see us for that meeting, which is at 10 o'clock. We're structured a little bit differently than some municipalities. Not all municipalities are civil service. However, we are. Most people don't realize that our civil service status was actually adopted by a vote of the people. When the city became its own charter, there was an opportunity for the citizens to vote if they wanted to have a civil service commission and civil service employment. The vote for that was basically to help prevent and eliminate preferential treatment when hiring individuals into government. Our civil service guidelines are a little bit strict, a little bit more so than the hiring practices of other private sector people. We do have job requirements and postings that are required under our guidelines. Testing and candidate interview required as well. We compile final candidate lists and have to provide by those lists. And we also have to administer this in correlation with federal employment regulations, which do trump some of our civil service, so we have to try and work together with that as well. All of our employees are hired under a probationary period. It runs from 6 to 18 months prior to their permanent appointment. During those 6 to 18 months, they do have a evaluation to make sure that they're doing well in their job every 3 months, 6 month, 9 month period, and then finally on the 12-month period. For training and development and performance, our staff does conduct manual mandatory trainings. The first one that we do conduct every year is the drug-free workforce training. We also conduct recognizing sexual harassment and hostile work environment. We monitor certifications for driver safety. This year, with the help of funding from you, we finally instituted and are starting a customer service training that did roll out in March of this year. We also, this fall, will be starting first line management and supervisor training. And we are in the process of developing an employee onboarding program and a leadership and development training. Our Human Resource Department also does administer the annual performance appraisals, so we are the ones that take care of that to make sure that those are conducted for all of our full-time employees. And then we also assist staff with other training requests that they make. This year we have done some stress in the workforce training. We are also doing some other training with regard to, we've had some requests for Excel training, something we can't provide, but we will be looking into that for them as well. The Human Resource Department is also the risk management and employee safety faction that oversees that. We do all the workforce safety claims for the injuries. With regard to administering that, not only do we process the claims, we do the injury reviews, and we also do the supervisor follow-up. And then in turn, we also contact workforce safety and help assist the employees if there's going to be any lost pay. Our staff conducts monthly safety meetings to comply with our workforce safety grants. This does require us also to provide monthly safety training materials to the various departments. We conduct annual training on drug-free workforce as required by our safety grant. And we do monitor random quarterly alcohol and drug testing for controlled substances, which does encompass us doing monitoring for most of the Public Works Department because of FTA and FMCSA licensing. In the last 7 years since I've been here, the City of Minot has successfully passed the Workforce Safety and Insurance Audit. And in the last 2 years alone, the discounts that we earned by passing those audits amounted to about $274,000. So being safety conscious is very important to our organization, and it does pay off in the end for us. We are also involved with employee relations and recognition. The human resource staff does conduct all investigations of employee complaints and personnel issues. Our staff does conduct exit interviews for outgoing employees to determine turnover trends. We administer annual open enrollment sessions for changes in enrollment into health benefits. This year, we're going to be expanding that into a health fair, so we're hoping to provide some additional services to our employees as well without additional cost. We also host the annual Employee Awards Recognition Reception to thank our city employees for their years of dedicated service. And since most everybody is not aware that that does happen in December, it's a very busy time of the year, I thought it would be important that we also give recognition this evening for those individuals putting in service. So I am providing a list of those employees that were recognized. For 30 years of service, we did have 3 individuals, including our police chief. 25 years of service. Terry Ward was an individual with our fire department who is now since retired. 20 years of service. Charles Guzman worked for our recreation department. He is also since retired. 15 years of service. 10 years of service. And then we did have a significant number of employees that have 5 years of service. So they were recognized during that ceremony. The Human Resource Department achievements. We successfully completed enrollment and education for our city employees to participate in ND PERS in less than 6 months. Generally, when you're taking on a benefit of this nature, it usually takes about a year to gather information, get your participation paperwork taken care of, and provide education. So I'm happy to say we did do that in less than 6 months. We also successfully researched and completed the enrollment so that our employees could participate in the flexible spending accounts, again in less than 6 months, so we've had a very busy fall. We completed development of our mandatory customer service training curriculum. We also developed a customer service training guide that includes phone numbers and other numbers for area organizations, not just for our own, simply because our employees are getting calls not just for our services, but services around the city. So we do have a guide completed for that as well. Our department developed tuition reimbursement program for eligible employees. The program is currently utilized by 5 of our employees who are completing graduate and undergraduate programs. We administered, posted, recruited, and tested for 61 positions. This did include 2 to 3 recruitment rounds for our police and fire. And in that administration, we processed 675 applications and resumes. I also am happy to say that 2 of my human resource staff have successfully obtained human resource professional certifications. And then I also wanted to point out to an organization-wide achievement, and this was with the help of the council from last year. There were several improvements for our employee benefits that were made to boost our morale and retention, and also to help with our recruitment. The goal of those benefits was to decrease our turnover rate by at least 2% annually. I'm happy to say that our current year-to-date turnover rate is at 3.6%, as compared to last year at this same time, which was 5.67%. If the current trend continues, our annual turnover rate for 2019 would be at 9% or lower. So I hope that that trend does continue because it is going in the right direction. And then I thought it would be interesting just to review a slide from last year when we were doing the budget and going over the cost of adding the improvements to our plan. We gave you information as to the cost of what the turnover rate was from 2017 because we had data available, just in the cost of downtime and recruitment and replacement costs. The cost to add the improvement plan last year for our employees was $567,000, about $568,000. On an average, we looked at the cost at $53,500 per employee. We were trying to save 10 employees to lower our percentage of our turnover by 2%. If we lowered it by 2%, we would have paid for the improvements of that plan. That was achieved in 2018, as our rate from 2017 was almost 15%, and our rate from 2018 was at less than 13%. If we reduce it again by another 2%, it's going to actually save us another $568,000. But I'm happy to say if our trend continues, we'll actually be at the 9% target rate. So we'll be saving about $1,100 on the cost of those benefits versus what we would have had for the turnover. Department challenges. Implementation of the new ERP system is going to be the main challenge for us. We are a department that does everything basically manually, and that also includes paper. We kill trees on a daily basis, I'm sad to say. Implementing this particular system is going to be about 2,000 plus staff hours required from us for data conversion. Because we are basically paper format, most everything that we have is going to have to be converted from paper. Hopefully, in implementing this, we will also find more efficient processes during the software conversion project, because we do things probably very redundantly in a lot of places. And another important challenge is we will have to assist our employees in the change management part of this as we move from a time card to a timekeeping system. So there will be some challenges along the way for everybody. And then basically, why do we do this? Again, I'm a people person. I'm not a report person. I love my job. I love the people that I work with. I believe our employees are our greatest asset. They are the face and the heart of our organization, and that is what we need to see. Our department is here to assist those employees because those employees in turn do serve the community, and that's important. And we take pride in what we do. I find it rewarding to hire an individual and tell them they're starting in a great organization and trying to see them develop over the time. So that's why we do what we do. And with that, if you have any questions.
Thank you, Lisa. Any questions for Human Resource Director?
Thank you.
If not, thank you, Lisa. Seeing as we're on the roll with our reports, we'll move to number 10 on our liaison reports. Alderman Pittner, I think we'll start with you today.
I really don't have any liaison reports at this point. I'll leave the County Ward Planning County Planning and Zoning to Mr. Wolski. I will be starting my term next month on the library board, so I'll have an update for you on the next liaison report. So with that, I cede my time.
Alderman Janser.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The City-County Liaison Committee hasn't met, so other than some work on budget matters coming up, no further report.
Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, I was gone for a bit of time, so I don't have a significant report on several of the committees, but on the Ward County Comprehensive Plan, we had a County Planning Commission meeting, I think it was last Tuesday, and that project is, I think, on our agenda for Thursday night for first adoption by the Planning Commission. And there's, multitudes of readings and open public hearings, and the County Commission eventually gets it. But one of the late amendments that I maybe is much a part of a passion project for me, but did get added to the county's larger transportation plan and initiative is a kind of a quality of life initiative with the attempt, and again, this is just putting things into a plan, no funding or direct intent or actions, but for terrestrial paths, river trail, really to try and connect the entire valley network, really from Burlington almost down to Valva and reaching out to some of our smaller bedroom communities, the Granvilles, the Surreys, things like that. So it just was for me, it was personally an exciting element to get included into that larger plan so it can be part of future planning.
Thank you, Alderman Walski. Alderman Straight.
I've had a tough couple weeks, Mr. Mayor. I'm not going to add anything, but I am curious to hear what we're doing about the census for next month. Throw that out there.
All right. Well, we will certainly add that to the list at our next meeting for further conversation. Alderman Olson.
Well, this isn't so much a committee, but I do want to invite everyone to the Juneteenth observance on Wednesday. If you aren't familiar with what Juneteenth is, then you should be joining us. I think if you look on your calendars, you'll say, what in the world is it? Well, we're going to celebrate it on June 19th at noon on Wednesday at the flagpole outside of City Hall, so please join us.
Thank you, Alderman Olson. Alderman Patergula.
I also have no report because the groups I'm assigned to have not been meeting.
It's been a quiet month in some respects. I do realize, too, that many of you have been attending many other meetings, seeing you around, for instance, at the stakeholder IEDC meeting this morning, amongst many others. So we'll follow up next month with more so of what has been transpiring since now. Till then. That takes us to number 11, which is under our miscellaneous and discussion items. I asked staff to put this on late last week, the gathering space property negotiation deadline. As we're all aware that this negotiation has been going on since February, and several rounds of discussions back and forth with all of the different property owners. The latest report that did come in, we've made a little bit of progress. However, we still have a significant distance on at least one or more properties to go. Looking at our deadline for this entire National Disaster Resiliency Program of September 30th of essentially 2022, we also have to come into the realization that our time frame is ticking away on this gathering space. We've often discussed the importance of it, and I think to do the due diligence of understanding whether we need to purchase property, do demolition, and build the facility within the time frame that is remaining, I think it prudent that we do set a time frame for ending the negotiation period for Site 2, which was selected by the community. I'm looking at, I would make the proposal of September 30th of this year, September 30th of 2019, to substantially make progress with all of the property owners for at least the agreement for purchase so that we can either move forward with Site 2 or for this governing body to pivot and move in another direction, whether it be Site 1 or Site 3 within that time frame. That would take us out of the construction season for 2019 and would leave us with 2020 and 2021 to accomplish what we have, with the remainder of 2022 to hopefully be well and done by that time period and wrap up that portion of the grant. To keep in mind, one last piece before I turn it over for some discussion, is that this was one of the lower rating pieces within the NDR application as they did come back. However, I think we as a community have rated it, I think, fairly high within our own resiliency and economic redevelopment in our downtown. If this money looked like it would not be used, we do have the assurance, at least from our advisor to HUD, which is Mr. Zakian, that money could be reallocated into other higher rating areas such as LMI or resilient housing in that regard. However, I think all of us have made the commitment to substantially vet and work through this process to fruition to get a gathering space built in our downtown area. So I would propose to the governing body tonight to move forward with placing a deadline for our negotiations for Site 2. I would certainly entertain any other input or perhaps even a motion of that for further discussion. Alderman Pittner.
Thank you, Mayor. Maybe for the city manager, maybe yourself, when did the negotiations start on Site 2?
I'll turn over the greater details to our city manager.
Right, thank you, Mr. Mayor. We had reached out to property owners prior to this year to identify any interest in selling any of the properties in and around the gathering space that had been identified, but formal negotiations didn't start till February of this year.
Alderman Straight.
City Manager Barry, did we ever at any point, seeing that it was an involuntary acquisition, did we ever ask anyone if they would donate property?
Don't know if per se we asked folks to donate property, but we certainly would take donated property. Based on the HUD rules that we were following, the assumption is that, we pay fair market value for those, and that's where the negotiating started was. It was the assessed value. If the assessed value was out of date, it was assessed value plus 10%. Those are the guidelines essentially we started with, and then depending upon what circumstances folks brought or improvements folks made us aware of that we were not aware of, that kind of goes into the negotiating practice as well. But we're not aware of anyone that's willing to donate any of the properties that we need, except for the city, who has 2 of the 9 properties that are in the gathering space area. Of course, those are, essentially already owned by the public, if you will.
And as a quick reminder as well, when the city made application to HUD, we had said that the public gathering space would be 2 acres or as close to 2 acres as we could possibly get, which also substantially narrowed the scope between essentially 3 different areas downtown, site 1, 2, and 3. Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sima, thank you. We don't have a formal motion here, but I'll just share some general comments. If we get to a motion, so be it. Happy to see what the council chooses in this. But I do not support adding a deadline to these particular negotiations. If we get to a point where we're struggling and we need to think of a different option, the option that I would like to see the city pursue is a revision of the project in some form. I think the degree to which the public supported this location was so overwhelmingly yes for Site 2 that I'm just not comfortable changing that particular direction and going to another location. Now, I understand all the challenges that come with the negotiations, and I understand the need to move the project forward. But as an alternative solution to a negotiation deadline, I would prefer to see the city, revise the terms of the project to fit inside footprints that we can acquire.
At this point, I would normally ask Mr. Zakian to come forward on this one. We've already substantially revised this in acquiring property that wasn't part of the original. Further revision likely would be going to HUD for a substantial amendment, which cost us, city manager, if my memory isn't great, was it 6 months or 8 months off that?
It's about 6 months, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
And that is contingent if they were to approve.
I think one other risk, if I may, Mr. Mayor, is if the projects, depending upon Alderman Wolski's suggestion, and I don't know exactly what's involved there, but if the project changes substantially, that could cause a re-rating of the entire application and then bring everything in. And of course, if that was to happen, that would take much longer than 6 months and could jeopardize other aspects. I'm not saying that to suggest we not do that, but just don't
for consideration.
Yeah, exactly.
Alderman Pittner.
And I'll put my thoughts out there, and if it manifests into a motion, I guess so be it as well. We've had 4 months of formal negotiations. We've had several months more than that of this being on the property owner's radar. To me, I think September 30th is more than acceptable. I think I would actually like to see it shorter. I think we as the city, not willing to walk away from a deal, we're going to get burned. I think entering any negotiations on any deal, if you're not willing to walk away, you're going to get taken to the cleaners. So I won't charge anybody for that bit of advice, but again, I would like to see August 30th, July 30th. It's dragging on. We need to move. We need to something or get off the pot. And that's just kind of the way that I feel this needs to happen. I understand the frustration on both parts, whether it be property owners or whether it be the city staff or officials or people investing in downtown. But again, we're looking to build a gathering space that's going to be a crown jewel of our city, and we still have people complain about that. Why are you building a park downtown? We don't need any more parks. I mean, we hear it all. There's a lot of different trains of thought on this, but I think if we really want to see this project move forward, we need to put some hard deadlines and hold not only ourselves, but other people accountable to those deadlines as well.
Alderman Olson.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make a motion that we do set a deadline for negotiations of August 30th, 2019.
We have a motion of August 30th of 2019 for the negotiations on Site 2.
Second.
Second by Alderman Pittner. Further discussion? Alderman Straight.
I guess from my standpoint, as the liaison to this project, there's $2.5 million for acquisitions and demolition. And where this project, I think, goes sideways and has gone sideways is unfortunately the reality that we've deferred to HUD in the guidelines with the inability to discuss the larger concept as a whole. So as a result, we have property, this is my opinion clearly, we have property owners that are in negotiations with the city, not knowing what's going to happen to their property. But we also are sticking to some idea that we have some considerable amount of demolition, maybe based off of an initial concept that city staff designed that is probably not ultimately what the public wanted. And so I guess the larger question to Alderman Pittner and maybe is, what is it ultimately going to, if we have to spend a little more money to acquire these properties for ultimately what might be one of the more dynamic spaces if we can deliver it, what's that worth? Yeah, I can understand your point that if we don't set a firm deadline, we create maybe challenges with that. But I think what I've heard ultimately through this process is the public wants some indoor space. They don't want a public park. They might want an element of a public park, but we want indoor market space. We want some indoor dynamic spaces because it's cold and the climate isn't great here. And so I think that we've unfortunately allowed the guidelines to become so rigid, and my fear is that we've become so rigid that the ultimate rationale for why we were given the funds is increasingly now just alienated everyone. And everybody's frustrated. And I fear that by setting a hard deadline, maybe at the end of the day, that gets the conspiracy theorists ultimately for us to talk about a different site. But I'm not going to support a deadline. I just think that we need to have a better process for negotiation. I think maybe we might need a mediator because there's not a lot of trust and faith, I think, in our negotiations. And I think if we can at least acknowledge that because of our mistakes in the past have put us in the situation where people don't have a lot of faith in us because of how we ascertain the money, I think it's imperative that we maybe double down and at least recognize, like, hey, this project does matter. I find it ironic that we're now saying that this was one of the lowest scoring projects, and we're kicking this so far down that the project doesn't even matter, where at the beginning I think I can distinctly recall City Manager Staub saying the gathering space was the reason why we were awarded the funds. I bet if we possibly even look back through some documentation, we might even see that written in the minutes. So I just think we have to try harder and work harder. I find it incredibly frustrating that Mr. Zakian is not here again. City Manager Barry, I have to tell you in all honesty, as someone who's put 3 years in this project, because that leads to just more frustration. So, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Mayor, if I can.
Mr. City Manager.
Alderman Straight, I understand and appreciate your sentiments on this. I just maybe would reflect on a couple comments. First of all, it is unfortunate that Mr. Zakian couldn't be here tonight. He's on medical leave, so he's not available this evening. I apologize about that. Our council meetings, of course, have to run on regardless of the medical situation of our staff. I can tell you that last year when we had our visit from HUD representatives, pretty high up HUD representatives, they encouraged me to consider reallocating money away from the City Hall project and the gathering space to acquisitions. I can tell you firsthand that HUD is not in favor of those two projects within the NDR application. Of course, I pushed back on that, and we're continuing with those projects as we had originally had them approved by the NDR application and subsequent granting documentation. So I don't know that that's a fair statement. I don't know what's been said earlier, prior to my arrival, but I can tell you that firsthand conversations with HUD, they'd love to see the dollars be used to other NDR program components, which we're trying to avoid because we are all excited about this project. I think it's great for our community, and I think there isn't a person up here that wouldn't want to see this project happen. So I just maybe wanted to mention that, quickly, because I think that's important as well.
Alderman Patragula.
I wanted to follow up on that. When you say acquisition, Tom, acquisition of what? Where do they want us to spend this money? I mean, it seems like they were giving us two messages. The message we've gotten is that we won the project because it was a very balanced proposal, and we've gotten support for it. And now you're telling us that they don't see this as a big deal and want the money spent elsewhere. Where's the elsewhere?
Alderman Patragula, in the resilient neighborhoods and the acquisitions of those areas in Northeast and over by where the Moose Club was. Those homes were part of the NDR acquisition buyout for flood storage, not for flood control, but to get people out of
harm's way.
That was a significant part of the NDR program.
So they're suggesting putting more money into getting people out of harm's way now.
Correct.
That is where they had made the suggestion, and to reaffirm what City Manager Barry had said, that there was pushback from HUD in the reaffirming that this community is very adamant about the public gathering space, and it's important to having a resilient economic facility downtown and vibrancy downtown.
But this wouldn't be toward extra housing. It would be out of getting people out of harm's way, not building more housing.
That was their suggestion.
Okay.
Alderman Straight.
Mr. Mayor, I was unaware of Mr. Zakian's leave, so I meant no ill will. I would say, though, that as a result, City Manager Barry, I have grave concerns as someone who participated in so many post-flood meetings and the therapy that has come out of that and the anger from Brownfields meetings to Riverfront and Center to now a discussion that's taking very public, it's maybe a good thing that some of the media has left. If we're going to now shelve or consider possibly shelving another project, I think that we lose a lot of distrust or trust. And I think that's something that you need to be very mindful of in terms of having the public trust. And I think maybe under the circumstances, if we're going to consider a deadline, Mr. Barry, and I'm not familiar with Mr. Zakian's health concerns, but it might be in your best interest, sir, to appoint someone else or have somebody else from staff be involved in the negotiations, because I think it might help move the process. And I'm sorry to hear about Mr. Zakian, because I've had a couple tough weeks myself. So,
Alderman Straight, I understand emotions run a little bit high, but not once are we considering shelving the gathering space. I want to make that very clear. Not once. We're continuing to fight to make sure that this goes through and continuing to fight to see that it gets built. I'm very prudent of the timeframes that we're working on here, and we got to make it clear to the community that we're serious about building a gathering space, and that is my point, to a deadline, so that we functionally work through the processes that were identified by the community. Alderman Straight.
Mr. Mayor, if you will, then let's appoint a mediator and get it done.
I would
Or at
have
least
to,
have a very public conversation of yay or nay.
to further go down that road, we would have to take a look at what the HUD guidelines are for that.
They
Because
can
if we get
participate.
outside of the HUD guidelines, then we might as well shelve the project. We have a motion and a second for a deadline of negotiation of August 30th of 2019. Alderman Pittner.
Just a clarification, if this deadline were to come and pass without a resolution on Site 2, are Site 1 and 3 the only remaining sites that we've looked at? Are we willing to look at other sites? Are there possible other sites? I was just curious. Obviously, it wasn't a part of the process.
We did have the 3 original sites that were located that went through the public input. I would assume that we would either defer to the second highest rating site, with which, if memory serves correct, was Site 1, or we could choose to go through the public input process for further direction on Site 1 or 3. Continue.
And thank you, Mayor. The only reason I ask is maybe somewhat of Alderman Straight's, maybe someone willing to work with the city in collaborative effort, to maybe identify a third site, or a fourth site, I guess. That's the only reason I bring it up.
That was part of the challenge as well, just because of the space needs and what is identified as downtown. Alderman Wolski.
If I might just play out a couple of these little contingencies that I've heard sort of offered here tonight. Speaking only for myself, and I supported the site we're investing in right now in the beginning. Were we to scratch that one off the list, I would be frustrated by that process that took place 18 months ago, then just diverting to the second position on the list, because that wouldn't have been if we're choosing between Site 1, 2, and 3, my selection would be Site 2. If we're choosing between Site 1 and 3, now I have a different opinion, right? And I think the public, essentially the selection of the gathering space location, if we were to go back to just, I think the votes that were given online, which was like 10,000, 9,500 people would not get what they want, and we would be left with about 500 people who ultimately chose the location of the gathering space. Because it would just be those remaining folks who voted for the other 2 locations. That's not a public process I have a ton of faith in. So I think that would be something we would need to evaluate and vet out internally about how we go on to that next location if we ever cross that bridge. Like I said previously, I'm not going to be able to support this motion tonight, and I'm not going to be able to support moving this project to another location. I think if we trigger that next location, we start the environmental review process all over again. We start the voluntary acquisition process all over again. We shouldn't kid ourselves in the sense that we can all of a sudden move forward on this project on September 1st if the deadline passes. All the different steps that have brought us to this point, we still have to go through them again. And so I'll be quiet now. Everybody knows where I stand, but thank you.
Alderman Pittner.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a quick, maybe educate me a little bit, maybe City Manager Barry. Is it possible to negotiate on multiple sites? I mean, again, we could also back ourselves into the corner of the next site doesn't work, and then we have to move to the next site. To maybe put some pressure on not only ourselves, but some of the people that we're negotiating, that we are having maybe open negotiations with multiple sites to ensure this acquisition is expedited?
Thank you, Alderman Pittner, Mr. Mayor, City Council members. We have to be very careful about that because the HUD rules say we can't expend HUD dollars in that process without an approval of or release of funds, essentially, which has happened on the site that we've all been talking about here. So if the City Council wants to divert its own money to negotiate, do the environmental review and those kinds of things to get a jump start on a second site, you could certainly do that, but we couldn't do that until we bring to a close using federal funds, that is, until we bring to a close this first site. I just maybe want to allay some hypersensitivity to this. No one's talking about not moving forward with the site that's been selected. No one's talking about shelving the project. No one's talking about anything other than putting some pressure on the project to reach a milestone that in the event, and I think it's a very small likelihood, but in the event we can't reach agreement on some configuration of properties that's needed to satisfy our application in the site that we have, that we've afforded ourselves time to go through this entire process again on whatever site, ends up being the next site, just in the event. And as you can see, the approvals we've had to get from HUD, the negotiation, the concept, all of those kinds of things have taken us a lot of time to get where we are on this site. So I think it's prudent for the city council to make a recommendation to put a period of time where we have to move on. There's a decision point here. Or we run the risk of running the clock out on this project and not getting anything. And I just want to remind the council that we agreed to a process last year when we went through the public process of who's going to vote on what sites, that if one site didn't work, we would take the next highest voted site. That was what was agreed upon. That's what we told HUD we would do. And then if that didn't work, we go to the next one. I mean, that was all part of the process. So to kind of throw that out, I think is also premature at this point. I think right now we put all of our effort on making this project work. We have to work with the property owners who we cannot force to do anything, but we also need to have a time certain where we can comfortably say, we've got to pull the plug and move to something else so we don't run out of time. I think it's prudent that you're having this conversation now.
Further discussion? Alderman Straight.
I guess, Mr. Mayor, I would love you to take over the negotiations. I too, I'm not going to support moving to another site, and I guess it has nothing to do with my 3 years of investment in this project. I think it just has more for us to do with, we get so caught up, I think, selfishly thinking about ourselves or our own position within HUD, or I think we have to remember the 10,000 people that voted on it. I think we got to keep in mind the multiple public comment meetings that we've had. I think we have to keep in mind, I've heard rumors that maybe our other political subdivision wouldn't even entertain an idea of moving elsewhere, and then the city would probably have to take over. So I think we just have to get beyond it. And I think it would be in our best interest, Mr. Mayor, if you would be more involved in the process. I think there are a lot of people that trust your judgment, and I feel bad to hear about Mr. Zakian, but I think in terms of timeliness and expediting the process, I would personally like to ask you, Mr. Mayor, to be more involved. And because without, I don't know how this is going to move forward. And again, to my original point, there's $2.5 million in there for acquisitions and demolitions. If we can't talk about the larger concept, I don't know how we can even talk about dollars being allocated. I think it's such a backwards process, and to hear that we would be considering allocating the dollars elsewhere, I think it would be in our best interest to either go all in on this site, go to bat for the public and for what we are wanting, even if it costs us a little more to acquire the properties, or we walk away from the meetings and from NDR, and we have the projects we've had, and let's give the money back and recognize that it's just too much work, I guess.
I think without looking over shoulders, with previous mayors and in previous conversations and negotiations, I certainly could help facilitate in some of that where possible. And I look to Chris here as we'll have to figure out what that is. But I think that is something that I can help facilitate where possible. Further discussion on the deadline of August 30th, 2019. Further discussion. call the roll.
Olson?
Yes.
Pittner?
Yes.
Padrigula?
Yes.
Straight?
No.
Wolski?
Nope.
Sitma?
Yes.
Janser?
Yes.
Motion is approved. That takes us to number 12 on our schedule for this evening. That is adjournment.
Motion to adjourn?
Motion by Alderman Pittner,
Second?
second by Alderman Janser. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. We're adjourned.